Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we step carefully onto a Viking longship as a winter evening kettles across a dark northern fjord. The water is black and still the mountains are fading into blue shadows, and a thin crust of frost has already begun creeping across the wooden planks beneath your boots. The crew is moving quietly around you, tightening ropes, checking oars, pulling thick cloaks tighter against the cold. It all feels adventurous and heroic for about 10 seconds. Then the wind shifts and slides straight through your wool tunic and you realise something important. You probably would not survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what your local time is right now. Now dim the lights. The last light of day fades across the fjord as you step fully aboard the longship. The deck rocks gently beneath your feet, not violently, just enough to remind you that this narrow vessel is very much alive with the rhythm of the sea. Around you, the crew works with quiet efficiency. They are not rushing, but there is a clear sense of preparation. Night on the water is not something Vikings take lightly. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Viking longships were designed for speed and flexibility rather than comfort. These vessels were long, narrow, and shallow, often stretching between 20 and 30 meters. They could travel across open seas, but also slip into shallow rivers and coastal inlets. That clever design helped make Viking voyages possible across huge distances. Unfortunately for you, it also means there is very little space for luxury, or privacy, or warmth. The longship itself feels like a skeleton of wood beneath your feet. Oak planks overlap along the sides in what shipbuilders call clinker construction. Each plank slightly overlaps the next, fastened together with iron rivets. This makes the hull flexible enough to survive rough waves. You might admire the craftsmanship for a moment if your toes were not already beginning to feel numb. You move a few careful steps along the deck. On both sides of the ship, round shields hang along the railing, their painted surfaces catching the last dim light of dusk. Red, yellow, and faded patterns stare out across the water. They serve as both decoration and protection during battle, but tonight they also block some of the icy wind that sweeps across the fjord. The crew members look remarkably calm about the temperature. Thick wool cloaks hang from their shoulders. Fur collars sit around their necks. Some have wrapped strips of cloth around their legs to trap extra warmth. A few men have already settled along the rowing benches, adjusting their gear for the long night ahead. You notice how narrow everything is. The entire deck feels barely wider than a modern hallway. When two sailors pass each other, they do so with practiced ease, turning sideways slightly without even thinking about it. Clearly, this is not their first night at sea. A curious little detail recorded in some archaeological finds suggests that Viking sailors sometimes slept sitting upright on the rowing benches themselves, wrapped tightly into cloaks or animal skins. There were no hammocks, no bunks, and certainly no soft mattresses waiting for tired travellers. Your seat is a wooden plank polished smooth by years of use. It is sturdy, dependable, and about as comfortable as a park bench in January. The sky above you deepens from blue to black. A thin sliver of moon appears between drifting clouds. The water reflects it faintly, turning the fjord into a quiet mirror. Somewhere near the stern, a sailor pulls a thick rope tighter around a bundled sail. The cloth flaps softly in the wind before settling down again. Every sound seems louder out here. Wood creaks. Ropes stretch. The hull shifts slightly as the current nudges the ship. You inhale slowly, and the air carries a mix of smells that will soon become very familiar. Salt from the sea? Pine tar used to seal the wood. Wet wool cloaks drying slowly against the cold air, and somewhere nearby the faint smell of fish. Historians still debate exactly how Viking crews organised their nighttime routines during long voyages. Written records from the period are surprisingly sparse, and most of what we know comes from archaeology and later sagas. But many scholars believe that crews rotated watch duties through the night, allowing some sailors to rest while others kept an eye on the sea. That system would make sense because the ocean does not politely pause while people sleep. You glance toward the bow of the ship where the carved dragonhead rises above the water. Even in the darkness it looks impressive. The carved wood curves upward in a fierce expression meant to frighten enemies, and perhaps a few sea spirits as well. There is a strange, quiet confidence among the crew. No one complains about the cold, no one asks when they will reach warmer land. Instead, they move through small evening tasks with steady focus. One sailor checks the oars, making sure each one rests securely in its place. Another tightens a leather strap that holds a shield against the side rail. A third sits quietly sharpening a knife, the stone sliding softly across the blade. A quirky historical tidbit suggests that Vikings sometimes brought small personal items on voyages that might seem unexpected today. Archaeologists have found gaming pieces and simple board games among ship burials. Even hardened sailors apparently enjoyed passing the time with a little strategy and friendly competition when conditions allowed. Of course, tonight with the wind biting and darkness settling in, no one seems eager to start a board game. The fjord grows darker by the minute. You pull your cloak tighter and sit down on one of the benches, trying to imagine spending not just one night here, but many. The wood beneath you holds the chill of the evening. Somewhere below your feet the sea presses gently against the hull. The crew slowly settles into their positions. Some sit quietly with arms folded inside their cloaks. Others stretch their legs or lean against the side rail. The ship drifts slightly as the current shifts, and just like that the frozen Viking night has begun. The cold will deepen soon, the sea will grow darker, and you're about to discover that surviving a night on a Viking longship requires far more patience than heroism. But for now, the fjord is quiet. The stars are beginning to appear, and the longship waits. The longship settles into the dark water with a quiet patience that feels almost deliberate. You sit along the bench where you placed yourself earlier, adjusting your cloak as the temperature continues its slow descent. The last glow of dusk has disappeared completely now, leaving the fjord wrapped in deep northern night. Above you, the stars grow brighter, scattered across the sky like frost crystals. Your eyes begin to adjust to the darkness, and the ship around you slowly reveals its shape. At first it seems simple, just wood and rope and sail, but the longer you sit here, the more the longship begins to feel like a living structure, a wooden skeleton built for movement across water. A commonly accepted historical detail tells us that Viking longships were masterpieces of practical engineering. Shipbuilders shaped each plank, carefully bending oak boards with heat and water before fastening them together with iron rivets. This overlapping plank style allowed the ship to flex slightly with the waves rather than fighting them. The result was a vessel that could survive rough seas while remaining fast and surprisingly light. From your bench you can see the ribs of the ship rising along the inside walls. Curved wooden frames run upward from the hull like the bones of some giant sea creature. These ribs support the sides of the vessel, but they also define the narrow living space where dozens of sailors must eat, work and sleep. You shift slightly, noticing how little distance exists between one bench and the next. The oar benches stretch in two neat lines along the length of the ship. During the day, these seats belong to rowers whose arms power the vessel through calm waters or tight rivers. At night, they become something else entirely. Tonight they are beds, or at least the Viking version of beds. The bench beneath you is just wide enough for a person to sit comfortably, perhaps lean slightly to one side if exhaustion demands it. There is no backrest, no cushion, only smooth wood polished by years of use. You run your fingers along the surface and feel tiny grooves worn by hands' boots and countless long journeys. Across from you, another sailor pulls his cloak tighter and stretches his legs carefully beneath the bench. The movement reminds you that space beneath the benches is not wasted either. Small bundles of personal gear rest there. Leather bags, coiled rope, a wooden shield laid flat to keep it out of the way. Everything has a place here. A curious detail that archaeologists have pointed out is that Viking crews often stored their shields along the outer rails of the ship while travelling. This served a practical purpose beyond simple decoration. The shields helped block waves and wind, offering a little extra protection to the men sitting along the benches. Tonight you are very grateful for that design choice, because the wind sliding across the fjord carries a sharp edge of cold. You glance upwards toward the mast rising from the centre of the ship. The tall wooden pole disappears into darkness above where the bundled sail hangs secured by rope. During the day that sail would stretch wide to catch the wind pushing the ship forward across open water. At night it hangs quietly, heavy cloth folded and tied like a sleeping giant. The mast itself feels enormous up close. You lean forward slightly and place a hand against it. The wood is rough beneath your fingers, solid and reassuring. If this ship truly is a skeleton, the mast is its spine. Nearby, one of the sailors shifts position and lets out a slow breath that briefly fogs the air. The cold has grown sharper since sunset. You can see it now in every exhale drifting upward in pale clouds. Despite the cramped conditions, there is an odd sense of order across the deck. Each crew member occupies a familiar position. No one argues over space. No one seems confused about where to sit or rest. Historians continue to discuss exactly how Viking crews organised sleeping arrangements during long voyages. Some interpretations of archaeological evidence suggest that rowers likely slept near their assigned oars, so they could quickly return to their positions when needed. That would explain why the benches themselves served as resting spots. It allowed the crew to remain organised even during the darkest hours. You imagine what that must feel like during an emergency. A sudden storm, an approaching enemy ship, the shout of a lookout cutting through the night. Every man would already know exactly where he belonged. For now, though, the sea remains calm. The hull shifts slightly beneath you as the current nudges the ship. The sound of wood gently pressing against water creates a slow rhythm. Creak, whisper, creak again. You begin to notice more small details in the structure around you. The planks forming the sides of the ship overlap like scales. Their edges are sealed with tar to keep water out. In some places you can see faint streaks of the dark resin where it was spread along the seams. The smell of that tar drifts constantly through the air. It mixes with the scent of damp wood and salt water until the entire ship carries a thick maritime smell that settles deep in your nose. A slightly unusual historical observation comes from excavations of preserved Viking ships where traces of pine tar were found not only along the hull seams but also smeared across ropes and tools. Tar helped waterproof many materials aboard the vessel, though it also meant everything smelled strongly of it. After a few weeks at sea, sailors probably carried that scent everywhere they went. You shift again, feeling the wood beneath you creak quietly. The longship responds to every movement. That is when you realise something simple but important. Unlike modern ships filled with metal structures and engines, this vessel is entirely alive with sound. Every rope tightening, every plank adjusting, every footstep sends tiny vibrations through the hull. The ship breathes. Farther toward the stern, a sailor adjusts the steering oar mounted along the side. It is enormous, longer than you expected, with a wide blade resting just beneath the water. The man guiding it keeps one hand resting lightly along the wooden handle, as if listening to the sea through his palm. Steering a Viking longship required constant attention. Even calm water could shift direction slowly through current or wind. The helmsman rarely abandoned his post completely. You watch him for a moment and wonder how many nights he has spent doing exactly this. The stars above grow brighter as the night deepens. Their reflections ripple across the black surface of the fjord. You pull your cloak tighter again. The structure of the longship surrounds you like the ribs of a wooden shelter, but it offers no roof against the cold sky. Only the open night stretches overhead, and somewhere beneath the quiet creaking of wood and the gentle breathing of the crew you begin to understand the simple truth of this vessel. Every plank, rope and bench has one purpose: to keep you alive on the water until morning. The cold deepens slowly, almost politely, as if the night does not want to rush the process. You sit along the rowing bench, shifting your weight from one hip to the other, while the longship rocks gently beneath you. At first you thought the bench might be tolerable for resting. Now, after a while, the hard reality of Viking comfort levels is settling into your bones, or more accurately into your lower back. Around you, the crew begins arranging themselves for sleep in ways that feel surprisingly organized for such a cramped vessel. There is no dramatic announcement, no bell ringing to signal bedtime. Instead, it happens gradually. One sailor stretches his legs and leans against a rolled cloak. Another tucks a fur bundle beneath his head. A third pulls his boots slightly closer to keep them from sliding across the deck. A widely accepted historical detail tells us that Viking longships carried crews that could range anywhere from 30 to 60 sailors depending on the vessel. That many people sharing a narrow deck means personal space becomes an idea rather than a reality. You glance along the length of the ship and realise just how close everyone sits. On both sides of the longship, the benches form a long row of wooden seats. Each rower normally controls a single oar that slides through a circular opening in the side of the hull. Tonight those oars rest quietly secured, so they will not drift loose during the night. Without the oars moving, the benches become the closest thing the crew has to sleeping quarters. One man beside you pulls a heavy fur across his shoulders and leans slightly backward, resting against the curved rib of the ship. His knees bend upward because there is simply not enough space to stretch fully. Across from him, another sailor lies partly on his side, his cloak wrapped tightly around his body like a cocoon. You try to imagine falling asleep like that. Actually, you try to imagine staying asleep like that. The bench beneath you barely supports your hips, and the cold wood continues to pull warmth from your body no matter how tightly you wrap your cloak. Every small movement from another sailor sends a faint vibration through the bench line. If one person shifts, several others feel it. Privacy does not exist here, not even a little. Yet the crew seems completely accustomed to it. A slightly unusual detail appears in some interpretations of Viking ship burials, where researchers found traces suggesting sailors often used bundled clothing or spare cloaks as pillows. Archaeological remains rarely preserve soft materials well, but impressions in the wood and small fragments of fabric hint that crews made use of whatever they carried to create small islands of comfort. You glance down at the bench again and try adjusting your position. The wood creaks softly. Immediately, the sailor on your left lifts one eyebrow and glances your way, not in annoyance, but in quiet awareness. Everyone aboard the ship seems to remain lightly alert, even when resting. This makes sense when you think about it. Historians still discuss how deeply Viking sailors actually slept during sea voyages. Some scholars suspect that sleep may have come in short cycles rather than long stretches, especially when ships remained exposed to weather and potential danger. In other words, this might not be a place for 8 hours of peaceful rest, more like a series of naps interrupted by cold noise and the occasional wave splashing over the side. Across the deck, one of the younger crew members tries to lie flat along the bench. It takes only a moment before his boots bump into the legs of another sailor seated nearby. A few quiet words pass between them, followed by a small shift of position. Problem solved, or at least partially solved. You begin noticing a pattern in how the crew arranges themselves. Larger sailors tend to sit slightly forward or backward on the benches, staggering their position so that knees and shoulders do not collide too often. Cloaks drape over laps, furs tuck beneath arms, and everyone seems to find a position that balances warmth with limited space. It's not comfortable in the modern sense, but it works. Works. A faint breeze slides across the deck, carrying the smell of salt and tar through the air again. Somewhere behind you, a rope taps softly against the mast. The longship creaks gently as the water shifts beneath the hull. The night grows quieter. Some of the crew have already closed their eyes, their breathing slowing into steady rhythms. Others remain awake for now, staring out across the dark water or adjusting gear beside them. One sailor near the bow pulls a fur blanket across his shoulders and mutters something quietly before settling down. You're not sure if he's talking to a nearby crewmate or simply speaking to himself. Perhaps a prayer, or perhaps just a complaint about the cold. A quirky historical observation comes from several Norse sagas that describe how sailors sometimes slept with weapons close at hand even during peaceful voyages. Not because they expected an attack every night, but because the sea had a way of delivering surprises. A drifting ship, a sudden squall, or an unexpected shoreline encounter could turn a quiet night into chaos quickly. Sure enough, you notice more than a few axes and knives resting within arm's reach along the benches. One sailor even keeps his spear leaning gently against the side rail beside him. It sways slightly with the movement of the ship. The stars above seem brighter now. Without the last traces of dusk, the sky reveals more of its distant lights. You lean your head back carefully, letting your eyes follow the long curve of the mast upward until it disappears into darkness. The air feels sharper with each passing minute. Your breath appears more clearly now when you exhale. The sailor beside you pulls his cloak tighter and tucks his hands beneath his arms for warmth. Another man draws his knees closer to his chest. Even with furs and wool, the cold finds ways to creep in, and yet despite the discomfort, the entire crew seems to settle into a quiet acceptance of the night ahead. No one complains loudly, no one demands more space or better bedding. This is simply how life works on a longship. The benches become beds, the cloaks become blankets, and sleep when it finally arrives must squeeze itself carefully between wooden ribs, cold air, and the endless patience of the sea. The night settles deeper around the longship, and with it the air grows heavier, with scents that seem to cling to every surface of the vessel. You sit quietly along the bench, wrapped tightly in your cloak, and slowly become aware that the ship has its own atmosphere. It is not just the cold that surrounds you now. It is a mixture of smells that tell the story of life aboard this narrow wooden world. The first scent that reaches you most clearly is salt. The sea itself breathes against the hull with every small movement of the water. Each gentle wave sends a faint mist into the air. Even when the water looks calm, tiny droplets travel on the wind and settle across the deck, across the ropes, and across the wool clothing of the crew. You run a hand along the railing and feel the dampness there. It is not soaking wet, but it is enough that the wood feels slightly slick beneath your fingers. Researchers widely agree that Viking ships constantly battled moisture. Saltwater sea spray and damp air surrounded these vessels during most voyages. Because of this, sailors became very familiar with living in clothing that was never fully dry. Your cloak, for example, is already beginning to carry the scent of the sea. Then there is the smell of tar. You noticed it earlier, but the longer you remain aboard the ship, the more dominant it becomes. Pine tar coats the seams between planks, seals rope fibres, and protects many wooden parts from rot. It is thick, sticky, and extremely effective at keeping water from creeping through the hull. It also smells powerful enough to fill the entire night air. A curious observation from ship excavations in Scandinavia shows that pine tar production was once a major industry in parts of the Viking world. Large pits were dug into the ground where pine wood was slowly heated to extract the tar. The result was a dark resin that could waterproof ships and tools. Without it, long voyages across open water would have been far more dangerous. You inhale again and realize that tar salt and damp wood form the base layer of the ship's scent. But they are not alone. The smell of wool drifts through the air as well. Nearly every crew member wears thick wool clothing. Cloaks, tunics, leg wraps, and gloves made from woven fibres trap warmth surprisingly well. Unfortunately, wool also absorbs moisture easily. When dozens of sailors sit close together in damp air, the smell becomes quite noticeable. It is not unpleasant exactly, just strong, earthy, a little like wet sheep mixed with sea wind. You glance along the row of sailors and notice how their cloaks bunch around their shoulders and arms. Some of the wool fabrics look coarse and heavy, clearly made for durability rather than fashion. Others show patches where the cloth has been repaired again and again. Archaeological textile fragments reveal that Viking clothing often relied on wool as its primary material, though linen was also common. Wool had one major advantage. It could still provide warmth even when damp, something extremely valuable during long sea journeys. Across from you, a sailor lifts his arm briefly to adjust his cloak, releasing another wave of wool scent into the cold air. Then another smell reaches you. Human presence. 30 or more sailors share this deck tonight. They have worked all day handling ropes, rowing oars, and moving cargo. Some have travelled for weeks already. Bathing opportunities on a moving ship are not exactly frequent. You do not need a historian to explain what that means. Still, compared with what you might expect, the scent of sweat is not overwhelming. The cold air helps with that. Freezing temperatures have a way of slowing down many things, including the spread of certain smells. A lesser-known detail recorded in historical sources suggests that Norse societies placed a surprising emphasis on personal grooming. Combs, tweezers, and ear-cleaning tools appear frequently in Viking-era archaeological finds. Some accounts from foreign observers even remark that Scandinavian men groomed their hair and beards regularly. Of course, grooming habits on land do not necessarily translate perfectly to a cramped longship in freezing weather. Still, the sailors around you do not look particularly unkempt. Several men wear braided beards. Others keep their hair tied back with simple leather cords. One sailor quietly runs a small comb through his beard before tucking the tool away into a pouch. The longship creaks softly as the water shifts beneath it. A faint breeze slides along the deck, again stirring the various scents together. Salt, tar, wool, damp wood, human breath. It becomes the smell of the ship itself. Experts continue to debate how Viking crews manage sanitation during extended voyages. There are no surviving instruction manuals explaining daily routines aboard longships. Some scholars suspect that sailors simply relieve themselves over the side of the vessel when necessary, a practical, if somewhat chilly solution during northern winters. You glance towards the edge of the deck and quickly decide that tonight might not be the most comfortable moment to test that theory. The cold has grown sharper again. Your breath appears in thicker clouds now as you exhale. Several sailors pull their cloaks tighter or tuck their hands beneath their arms. One man shifts slightly and pulls a fur bund closer around his shoulders. The mixture of smells does something interesting as the night deepens. At first they seemed overwhelming. Now they begin to fade into the background. Your senses slowly adapt, accepting the ship's scent as normal. It becomes part of the environment, part of the night. The quiet breathing of the crew blends with the creaking of wood and the distant whisper of water brushing the hull. The stars continue their silent watch above the mast. You settle deeper into your cloak and lean slightly against the rib of the ship. The longship carries its spell, its sounds, and its crew together through the frozen darkness. And somewhere in that mixture of salt air and tar, the Viking night continues unfolding around you. The cold keeps creeping inward. It does not arrive suddenly. Instead, it works patiently through the night air, slipping through wool fibers, sliding along damp wood, and quietly draining warmth from every surface of the longship. You feel it now in your fingers and the tip of your nose as you sit along the bench, watching the crew settle more firmly into their nighttime positions. The sea remains calm, which helps. Calm water means fewer waves striking the hull and fewer splashes of icy spray reaching the deck. Even so, the temperature continues to fall as the night grows older. This is when you notice something interesting happening near the center of the ship. A small group of sailors moves quietly toward a shallow metal container placed carefully between the benches. At first glance, it almost looks like a cooking pot, but as one of the men lifts its lid, you see the faint glow of embers inside. Not flames, just embers. Archaeological evidence from several Viking sites suggests that portable fire containers were sometimes used aboard ships for limited cooking or warmth when conditions allowed. Open flames on a wooden vessel were obviously dangerous, so sailors relied on carefully controlled heat sources. Even a small cluster of glowing coals could provide a little comfort during cold nights. The men handle the container with great care. One sailor kneels beside it and gently stirs the embers with a thin stick. The faint glow brightens slightly, releasing a soft warmth that drifts outward into the cold air. Another sailor places a flat stone over part of the opening to help control the heat. No one wants sparks flying across a deck made almost entirely of dry wood and tar. You lean forward slightly, drawn by the warmth. It is subtle. The heat does not spread far, but even that small difference feels comforting after sitting in the cold for so long. The sailors closest to the container stretch their hands toward it, careful not to crowd too closely. A quiet understanding seems to guide their movements. Everyone knows the fire is helpful, but everyone also understands as it could become dangerous very quickly. One curious historical observation comes from experiments conducted by modern researchers who built replica Viking ships and sailed them using traditional techniques. During those voyages, crew members found that maintaining even a tiny heat source aboard the vessel required constant attention. Wind direction, deck movement, and the flammability of surrounding materials meant the embers had to be watched closely at all times, which explains why the sailors near the container keep glancing down at it. The glow pulses gently as the coals shift. A faint smell of smoke joins the already complex scent of salt tar and wool drifting through the night air. The smoke is not thick enough to sting your eyes, but it carries a comforting reminder of fire, something every human instinct associates with warmth and safety. For a few moments, the crew gathers a little closer. Hands hover near the heat. Cloaks loosen slightly as people take advantage of the warmth. One man rotates his stiff fingers slowly above the container while another warms the edge of his cloak. Then, just as quietly as they gathered, they begin drifting back toward their benches. The fire remains in place, its soft glow guarded by two sailors who continue watching it carefully. It becomes the quiet heart of the ship. Researchers widely acknowledge that Vikings often relied on animal furs to help endure cold environments, particularly during travel. Thick pelts from animals such as sheep, deer, and even bear could trap warm air effectively when layered over wool clothing. These furs appear frequently in archaeological finds and historical descriptions. You notice several sailors adjusting such pelts now. One man near the bow pulls a heavy fur across his shoulders, the thick hair catching faint starlight. Another tucks a smaller pelt beneath his legs to block some of the cold rising from the wooden bench. The difference is noticeable. Where the fur rests, the sailor seems more relaxed. Where only wool covers the body, the cold still presses inward. You try pulling your cloak tighter again. It helps a little though, not quite enough to compete with the icy air drifting across the fjord. Somewhere behind you, the helmsman shifts his grip on the long steering oar. The wood creaks softly as the blade beneath the water adjusts direction slightly. The ship continues drifting forward at a slow pace. Dark water stretches endlessly around the vessel now. The shoreline is little more than a faint shadow beyond the bow. Experts continue to discuss how Viking crews balance the need for warmth with the constant danger of fire aboard wooden ships. Some historians believe fires were used sparingly and only during calm conditions, while others suspect that experienced crews developed reliable methods for controlling embers even in harsher weather. Whatever the exact answer, tonight's crew clearly understands the risk. Every movement around the ember container remains cautious. Every spark is watched. Every shift of wind is noticed. The glow flickers softly against the wooden ribs of the ship, casting faint orange light across nearby faces. For a moment, the sailors look less like silent figures wrapped in cloaks, and more like a group gathered around a distant campfire, except the campfire is small enough to fit inside a metal bowl, and the campfire sits in the middle of the sea. You extend your hands briefly toward the warmth before pulling them back into your cloak again. The heat is pleasant, but the night air remains dominant. Still, the little fire changes something about the atmosphere aboard the longship. The darkness feels slightly less heavy. The cold feels slightly less relentless. And the crew, though quiet and tired, now shares a small circle of warmth that pushes back against the frozen Viking night. The small glow of embers near the centre of the longship fades gradually as the crew allows the heat to die down. No one wants the fire burning too long, and certainly not unattended. Soon the metal container holds only a dull red shimmer beneath its lid. The faint warmth it offered drifts away into the night air. Now the cold feels sharper again. You pull your cloak higher around your neck and glance across the dark water. The fjord looks endless in the moonlight. A narrow silver path stretches across the surface where the moon reflects between slow-moving ripples. Most of the crew has settled into quiet stillness along the benches. Some appear to be sleeping already, their heads tucked into cloaks or resting against the wooden ribs of the ship. Others remain awake, staring outward into the darkness with calm, patient expressions. You soon realize why. Not everyone aboard the longship is allowed to sleep. Near the bow, two sailors sit upright with their eyes fixed on the water ahead. Their posture is different from the resting men around them. These sailors lean slightly forward, alert, scanning the black surface of the fjord. They are standing stretch. Historical sources and maritime research suggest that Viking crews commonly rotated watch duties during voyages. Ships travelling through unfamiliar waters or coastal areas required constant observation. Rocks, drifting ice, and other vessels could appear suddenly, especially during the night. The men keeping watch tonight seem used to the responsibility. One rests a hand lightly on the side rail while peering into the distance. The other shifts his position occasionally to warm his legs before returning his gaze to the horizon. You follow their line of sight, but the darkness reveals very little. The fjord appears empty. Still, the sailors continue watching. A quiet sound breaks the silence. Splash. You look down towards the water beside the ship. Something moved just beneath the surface. For a moment, the moonlight catches a ripple spreading outward across the black water. Perhaps a fish? Perhaps something else. The sailors at the bow noticed it too, but neither reacts with alarm. They simply glance toward the disturbance before returning their attention to the horizon. It is a reminder that the sea rarely sleeps. A curious historical note comes from Norse sagas that occasionally describe nighttime voyages where sailors reported hearing mysterious sounds from the ocean. While modern readers might imagine sea monsters or supernatural forces, many scholars believe these accounts likely refer to whales, seals, or schools of fish moving near the surface. Out here in the dark water, unseen life surrounds the ship. Another seemed follows a distant splash somewhere farther away. The fjord carries noise surprisingly well at night. With little wind and few other distractions, even small movements across the water travel clearly through the cold air. One of the watchmen shifts slightly and leans closer to the rail. He listens. For a few seconds, nothing else happens. Then the sound fades. You notice how carefully the crew maintains silence during these moments. No loud conversation, no unnecessary movement. Even those resting seem aware that others remain alert. Experts continue to debate how structured Viking watch rotations may have been during long sea voyages. Some historians believe crews divided the night into shifts, allowing different sailors to rest while others kept guard. Others suggest the system may have been more flexible, with experienced sailors stepping in whenever needed. Watching the two men at the bow, it seems likely that responsibility passed naturally among the crew rather than through strict schedules. These men look comfortable with their task. Their eyes scan the water again and again. The helmsman near the stern remains awake as well. His position demands constant awareness. One hand rests along the handle of the great steering oar, while the other adjusts the angle slightly whenever the ship drifts. Even in calm water, the vessel must be guided. You glance upwards toward the sail still bundled tightly around the mast. The cloth hangs like a dark shadow against the star-filled sky. Without wind filling the sail, the longship moves slowly under the pull of gentle currents and occasional oar adjustments earlier in the evening. The world feels very quiet. Only the water speaks. Creak, whisper, crick again. The hull flexes slightly as small waves pass beneath the ship. Each sound travels along the wooden structure like a message carried through the bones of the vessel. One sailor beside you stirs briefly, perhaps responding to the noise, then settles again. A faint breeze sweeps across the deck colder than before. Your deep breath rises in pale clouds once more. A lesser-known observation recorded by maritime archaeologists notes that Viking sailors often relied heavily on their hearing during night watches. In darkness, where visibility was limited, the sound of waves breaking against rocks or distant shorelines could provide important clues about nearby hazards. Listening becomes as important as seeing. The watchman at the bow seemed to understand this instinctively. One tilts his head slightly toward the water, as if studying the pattern of sound around the ship. The other shifts his weight and steps a little farther forward for a clearer view. For now, though, the fjord remains calm. No approaching vessels, no crashing surf, only the soft rhythm of water brushing the hull. Behind them, the rest of the crew sleeps, or drifts in and out of light, rests trusting the watch to guard the night. And you sit there quietly among them, wrapped in wool and cold air, listening to the vast darkness of the northern sea. The night has settled fully now, thick and quiet, the kind of darkness that feels almost solid around the longship. You remain seated along the bench, wrapped tightly in wool, while the fjord continues its slow breathing beneath the hull. Most of the crew has drifted into light sleep. A few still shift, occasionally adjusting cloaks or stretching stiff legs. The watchmen remain near the bow silhouettes against the pale reflection of the moon. Then you hear it, a sharp cracking sound. It's not loud, but in the stillness of the night it seems to echo across the deck. Instinctively, your eyes open wider and your shoulders tense. Crack! Another one follows. For a moment, your imagination races through possibilities. Perhaps the hull is splitting, perhaps the mast has shifted, perhaps the longship has struck something beneath the water. But none of the sailors react with alarm. One man opens a single eye, listens for a moment, then calmly settles back into his cloak. The helmsman glances briefly along the length of the ship before returning his attention to the water. Only then do you realize the sound is coming from the wood itself. The temperature has fallen even further since sunset. As the air grows colder, the wooden planks and ribs of the longship contract slightly. That tiny change in shape creates small popping or cracking sounds throughout the structure. Archaeological studies of preserved Viking vessels confirm that these ships were built with flexible hulls designed to move with the water. The overlapping plank construction allowed the vessel to bend gently under pressure rather than breaking apart. That flexibility made longships remarkably strong, though it also meant the ship constantly shifted and creaked as temperatures changed. Tonight the cold is making its presence known. Crack! Another small sound echoes near the stern. The wood is speaking again. You shift slightly on the bench, feeling the structure beneath you respond. The rib behind your back presses firmly through your cloak. Beneath your boots, the deckboards feel colder than before, as if the frost in the air is slowly working its way into every fibre of the ship. The fjord itself has grown quieter. Earlier you could hear occasional ripples against the hull. Now even those seem softer. The cold air dampens sound, creating a strange stillness across the water. Then comes another noise. A faint scraping sound slides across the side of the hull. Your eyes flick toward the rail, just in time to see something pale drifting past the ship. A thin plate of ice. The fjord is beginning to freeze in small patches. The ice sheet brushes gently along the hull before sliding away into the darkness. One of the watchmen notices it too. He leans over the rail, briefly studying the water before nodding quietly to himself. An unusual observation from maritime experiments with reconstructed Viking ships shows that crews sailing in colder northern waters occasionally encountered thin ice sheets forming along sheltered fjords during winter voyages. While thick ice could trap ships, entirely smaller drifting pieces usually pose little danger unless they accumulated around the hull. Tonight the ice seems thin and scattered. Still, the sight of it makes the night feel colder somehow. You tuck your hands deeper into your cloak. Nearby one sailor stirs as another crack echoes through the ship. He shifts his position, pulling his knees closer to his chest for warmth before settling again. His breath forms a steady cloud with every exhale. The longship answers, the cold in its own language. Creak, population, whisper. Each sound travels along the wooden frame like a message passing through bones. The structure flexes gently with the movement of water and air constantly adjusting to the changing conditions. It's not an alarming sound once you understand it. In fact, it almost becomes comforting. The ship is alive beneath you, responding to the night rather than resisting it. There remains some academic disagreement about how Viking sailors interpreted these nighttime sounds during their voyages. Some scholars believe experienced crews quickly learned to distinguish harmless creaks from dangerous structural shifts. Others suggest that new or younger sailors may have found the constant noises unsettling until they grew accustomed to them. You suspect the second idea might apply to you. Every time the wood cracks unexpectedly, your attention snaps back to the ship around you. Yet the crew remains calm. The watchmen continue scanning the water. The helmsman maintains his quiet position at the stern. Along the benches, sleeping sailors adjust their cloaks slightly whenever the cold presses too sharply against their bodies. The thin ice drifting across the fjord continues its slow journey past the hull. Another faint scrape slides along the wood before fading into the darkness behind the ship. You glance upward towards the sky. The stars seem brighter now than they did earlier in the evening. The cold air has cleared the clouds completely, revealing a wide stretch of glittering light above the mast. For a moment you focus on that quiet sky instead of the sounds around you. Then another crack echoes softly through the ribs of the longship. This time you do not tense. Instead you listen. The wood contracts again, adjusting to the cold, reminding you that this vessel was built to survive nights exactly like this one. The frozen fjord, the drifting ice, the restless creaking of timber. All of it is simply part of the longship's conversation with the winter sea, and somewhere within that conversation the crew continues sleeping. The cold deepens in a quiet, patient way that you almost do not notice at first. It slips into the spaces between breaths, creeps along the wooden ribs of the longship, and settles into the benches where the crew rests. You shift slightly where you sit, pulling your cloak tighter across your shoulders, trying to trap whatever warmth your body can produce. Across the deck, several sailors are doing exactly the same thing. One man lifts the edge of a thick fur pelt and drapes it more securely across his chest. Another wraps a second cloak around his legs. A third pulls the hood of his wool garment forward so only his nose and beard remain visible in the cold air. The crew is adjusting their layers. Excavations of Viking-era settlements and burials reveal that layered clothing was one of the most important defences against northern climates. Wool tunics, cloaks, trousers and leg wrappings created pockets of trapped air that helped retain body heat. When conditions became especially cold, animal furs provided an additional barrier against freezing wind. You begin noticing the details of those layers more clearly now. The sailor seated beside you wears a thick wool tunic beneath his cloak. The fabric looks dense and slightly rough, likely woven from tightly spun sheep wool. Over his shoulders rests a heavy cloak fastened with a simple metal brooch near the collarbone. The cloak itself appears almost blanket-like in thickness. Yet even that is not always enough. He reaches behind him and pulls forward a folded animal pelt from beneath the bench. The fur is long and dark, probably from sheep or perhaps goat. With a practiced motion, he spreads it across his lap and tucks the edges around his sides. Immediately, he seems more comfortable. Your own cloak suddenly feels a little inadequate by comparison. A small but fascinating detail uncovered by archaeologists is that Viking clothing often used natural lanolin from sheep wool as a partial water repellent. Because wool was rarely washed in harsh chemicals, the fibres retained some of their natural oils, which helped resist moisture and improve insulation. In other words, the slightly greasy feel of untreated wool actually made the garments more effective in damp environments. Tonight, surrounded by sea spray and cold air, that natural advantage matters. Across from you, another sailor pulls his legs beneath his cloak and wraps a second layer of cloth around his calves. These long strips of fabric, known as leg wrappings, spiral around the lower leg from ankle to knee. They help keep muscles warm and protect against wind. You can see several of the crew wearing them. The arrangement of clothing begins to resemble a small fortress built from fabric and fur. A cloak over the shoulders, a tunic beneath, leg wrappings around the calves, fur pelts over the lap, and hands tucked deep inside sleeves wherever possible. You try copying the strategy, shifting your cloak so it drapes over your knees and pulling your arms inside the folds. It helps a little. The wind sliding across the fjord still finds small openings, but the extra layers trap more warmth than before. Near the bow, one of the watchmen stamps his boots gently against the deck to keep blood moving through his feet. The motion is quiet but deliberate. Even the most patient sailor must occasionally remind his body to stay awake. One sailor further down the bench quietly rubs his hands together, then blows warm breath across his fingers. It is a small routine repeated by several others. An interesting observation recorded in a few medieval sources describes how Norse travellers sometimes slept with their cloaks pulled completely over their heads, leaving only a small opening for breathing. The cloak acted almost like a tent of fabric, trapping body heat close to the face. You notice one of the crew doing exactly that now. From a distance, he looks like a bundle of fur and wool resting against the rib of the ship, with only the faint movement of breath revealing the person beneath. Of course, clothing alone does not solve every problem. The wooden benches continue to pull warmth from the body. The air remains cold enough that each exhale becomes a pale cloud drifting upward toward the stars. There is still some uncertainty among historians regarding how frequently Viking sailors carried large fur blankets aboard long voyages. Some scholars believe pelts were common personal possessions brought by individual crew members, while others suggest that ships may have carried shared bedding supplies for especially cold conditions. Looking around the deck tonight, it seems likely that many sailors simply brought whatever furs they owned. The variety is noticeable. Some pelts are thick and luxurious, others are smaller and worn from years of use. One sailor even appears to have stitched together several smaller animal skins into a single patchwork covering. Every layer matters. You glance toward the stern where the helmsman remains steady at his post. Even he wears several layers, though his arms remain partially free so he can guide the steering oar without restriction. The longship creaks softly again as another small wave rolls beneath the hull. Above you, the sky remains brilliantly clear. Stars glitter across the darkness like scattered sparks frozen in place. The crew grows quieter as more sailors drift into shallow sleep beneath their layers of wool and fur. The watchmen continue their slow scanning of the fjord. And you sit there, wrapped in fabric and cold air, discovering that survival on a Viking longship during winter nights depends less on bravery and far more on something simpler. Layer after layer, cloth, fur, patience, and the stubborn determination to stay warm until morning. The longship drifts quietly through the frozen darkness, and for a while, the only movement you notice comes from the slow breathing of the crew and the gentle rocking of the hull. Yet beneath the stillness of the night, your stomach begins to remind you of something important. Warmth does not come only from cloaks and fur. It also comes from food. Earlier in the evening, before the sky turned completely dark, the sailors prepared a small meal. At the time it seemed simple, almost unimpressive compared to modern dinners. But now, sitting in the cold hours of the night, you realize how essential that meal truly was. Your body still carries the warmth it produced. Archaeological discoveries from Viking settlements show that seafarers often relied on practical, durable foods during voyages. Dried fish, salted meat, hard bread, and thick porridges made from grains were common staples. These foods could survive long journeys without spoiling, and provided the calories needed to fuel both rowing and survival in cold weather. You remember the moment the meal was shared earlier. A sailor opened a leather bag and removed several pieces of dried fish. Another passed around a wooden bowl containing a thick grain mixture that had been warmed briefly over the ember container. The smell had filled the air with a comforting earthy scent. No elaborate, no delicate presentation, just food that worked. You recall taking a small portion and noticing how dense the porridge felt. It was heavier than the soft oats many people eat today. The grains were coarse, perhaps barley or oats mixed with bits of dried meat or fat. One well-documented aspect of Viking diet is that barley was one of the most common grains across Scandinavia during the early medieval period. Barley could grow in colder climates where other crops struggled, making it a reliable food source for farming communities and travelling crews alike. When cooked into a thick porridge, it provided slow-burning energy, exactly the kind of energy needed on a night like this. A sailor seated 2 benches away quietly chews a final piece of dried fish that he saved from the earlier meal. The motion is slow and thoughtful, as if he wants the food to last as long as possible. Beside him, another drinks from a small wooden cup before tucking it back into a leather pouch. The smell of fish drifts briefly across the deck before fading into the cold air. A small but interesting detail uncovered here during excavations of Viking ships is the presence of wooden bowls, spoons, and drinking vessels among the artifacts recovered from burial sites. These simple eating tools suggest that even on long journeys, sailors maintained small personal utensils rather than sharing a single communal dish for every meal. You imagine how practical that would be on a crowded ship. 30 hungry sailors reaching into the same bowl at once might lead to chaos. Instead, small portions likely passed from hand to hand as the crew ate quickly before settling into the night. The warmth of that earlier meal lingers in your stomach now. It spreads slowly through your chest and arms, helping your body resist the chill pressing against your cloak. A quiet burp escapes from one of the sailors near the bow. He mutters something softly and pulls his fur tighter. Even the toughest warriors have human moments after supper. A faint breeze passes across the fjord again, stirring the sail bundle above the mast. The cloth shifts slightly before settling back into place. Your stomach tightens briefly as the warmth from the meal begins to fade. Calories burn quickly in cold environments. The body works harder just to maintain its core temperature. That means food becomes as important as clothing when facing freezing conditions. Some researchers studying Viking travel believe that sailors may have eaten several small meals throughout the day whenever supplies allowed. Rather than a single large feast, crews might have relied on steady intake of preserved foods to maintain strength and warmth. Looking at the tired men around you, that idea makes sense. Rowing, steering, repairing ropes, navigating unfamiliar waters, every task consumes energy, and every bit of that energy must come from food carried aboard the ship. A lesser-known anecdote recorded in medieval sources suggests that dried cod was particularly valuable during northern voyages. Cod could be preserved for long periods through drying, creating a tough but nutritious food that sailors could chew slowly even in harsh weather. One sailor across from you appears to be doing exactly that. He pulls a small strip of fish from a pouch and bites into it with deliberate patience. The texture must be tough because he chews for quite a while before swallowing. The smell of salt and fish briefly joins the familiar sense of wool and tar surrounding the ship. Then the pouch disappears back beneath his cloak. There remains some academic discussion about how often Viking crews cooked warm meals while travelling at sea. Some historians believe hot food may have been rare during active voyages due to the difficulty of maintaining fire aboard wooden vessels. Others suggest that calm conditions might allow occasional cooking using small controlled heat sources. Tonight's earlier porridge may have been one of those rare warm meals. You're grateful for it. The warmth it created inside your body continues to fight the creeping cold of the night air. Around you, the crew grows quieter again as full stomachs and exhaustion pull more sailors into light sleep. The watchmen remain alert at the bow. The helmsman keeps his steady grip on the steering oar, and the longship continues gliding through the frozen fjord, carrying a crew whose survival tonight depends on something surprisingly simple: warm food, thick clothing, and the patience to endure the long hours until dawn. The warmth from the earlier meal slowly fades and the night continues stretching forward with quiet patience. You sit along the rowing bench with your cloak pulled tight, listening to the soft rhythm of the longship as it moves through the dark water. Around you the crew appears almost motionless, now wrapped in furs and wool. They are breathing steady beneath the cold sky. Yet even in this calm moment, the ship is never truly resting. Rowers aboard a longship live with a constant awareness that their work may begin again at any moment. You notice in the way the sailors sleep. None of them stretch out fully. None of them sink into the kind of deep sleep that comes with soft beds and warm rooms. Instead, their bodies remain slightly tense, folded around the narrow benches where they sit. Arms are tucked close, knees bend upward, cloaks wrap tightly around shoulders and legs. It is sleep, but only the lightest version of it. Surviving Viking ships discovered in places such as Norway reveal long rows of oar stations along each side of the hull. These stations mark the positions where rowers sat during travel, each man responsible for controlling a single oar that extended through an opening in the side of the ship. When not actively rowing, those same benches served as the crew's resting place, which means the sailors around you are essentially sleeping in their workstations. The bench beneath you still carries the chill of the night air, though your body has slowly begun adjusting to it. The wood presses firmly against your hips and thighs. Every few minutes you shift your position slightly, searching for a more comfortable angle that does not quite exist. Across from you, one of the rowers lifts his head briefly and glances toward the bow. His eyes open for only a few seconds before he settles back into his cloak. It is the kind of sleep that never fully turns off. A small but fascinating detail found in Viking-era ship burials suggests that rowers may have kept their personal gear directly beneath their benches. Archaeologists examining the remains of ships like the Gokstad vessel discovered compartments and storage spaces near rowing positions where tools, weapons and belongings could be placed within easy reach. This arrangement makes sense when you think about it. If the crew needed to start rowing suddenly, everyone would already be sitting exactly where they needed to be. No scrambling, no confusion, just hands reaching for oars. You glance toward the circular openings along the side of the hull where the oars normally slide through. Tonight the oars rest quietly inside the ship, secured so they will not shift during the night. Each one is long and smooth, its wooden shaft worn shiny from years of use. It is easy to imagine how quickly the crew could move if necessary. A shout from the bow, hands grabbing oars, 30 men leaning forward in unison as the ship surges into motion. For now, though, the benches remain beds. One sailor 2 seats away begins snoring softly, a low rumbling sound that rises and falls with the rocking of the ship. The noise draws a faint smile from another crew member who shifts his cloak over his ear. Even Viking warriors are not immune to snoring. The helmsman at the stern adjusts his stance slightly, stretching his shoulders, before settling his hand back onto the great steering oar. His position requires him to remain awake longer than most. The steering oar must always be controlled even during calm nights. You can see the muscles in his arms moving beneath his cloak as he holds the heavy wooden handle steady. An interesting observation from maritime historians studying reconstructed Viking voyages suggests that rowing crews likely worked in shifts during long expeditions. Some sailors would rest while others handled navigation or watch duties, allowing the ship to maintain readiness without exhausting the entire crew at once. Looking at the tired men around you, that system seems entirely necessary. Rowing a longship demanded enormous strength and endurance. The long oars required coordinated effort from dozens of sailors working together. After hours of pulling against water, every muscle would ache, which explains why these men guard their rest carefully, even if that rest comes in short, uncomfortable bursts. There remains ongoing scholarly discussion about how disciplined Viking rowing formations truly were during nighttime travel. Some experts believe crews followed highly organized systems, while others think the arrangement may have been more flexible depending on the captain and conditions. Watching the crew tonight, the truth might lie somewhere in between. The men seem relaxed but not careless. Everyone remains aware of their place along the benches. The longship creaks again as another small wave slides beneath the hull. You feel the motion ripple through the bench line, passing gently from one sailor to the next like a quiet signal. A few men stir briefly before settling again. The stars above continue shining with cold clarity. Your breath drifts upward in pale clouds. And all along the narrow length of the ship, the rowers sleep lightly in the very places where at any moment their strength may once again be needed to push the longship through the dark waters of the Northern Sea. The quiet breathing of the crew settles into a slow rhythm across the longship. The benches are filled with men wrapped in cloaks and furs, their bodies folded into narrow spaces as the ship glides through the dark fjord. The watchmen remain alert near the bow, and the helmsman continues guiding the vessel with steady patience. Yet even in this calm moment, you notice something interesting about the sailors around you. They do not sleep empty-handed. Near your bench, one man has placed a short axe directly beside his knee. The handle rests against the wood so that his hand could close around it instantly if needed. Another sailor keeps a long knife tucked inside his belt, the hilt angled outward for quick access. A few benches farther down the ship, a spear leans against the rail within easy reach of its owner. No one seems particularly worried. No one is gripping their weapons nervously. The blades simply rest nearby as naturally as a blanket or a pillow. Evidence from Viking graves and archaeological finds confirms that weapons were deeply connected to personal identity in Norse culture. Many adult men carried knives or axes in daily life, not only for this combat, but also for everyday tasks such as cutting rope, preparing food, or repairing equipment. A sailor rarely travelled without one. That habit appears to continue even during sleep aboard the ship. You glance again at the axe beside your neighbour. The metal blade catches a faint glimmer of moonlight. It looks well used, but carefully maintained, its edge polished smooth from sharpening. The sailor shifts slightly and pulls his cloak higher around his neck, his hand brushing briefly against the axe handle before settling again. It seems almost instinctive. A fascinating minor detail uncovered in several Viking burial sites is the presence of small utility knives buried with individuals who are not necessarily warriors. These blades likely served practical roles in daily life. On a ship, such tools would have been especially useful for cutting rope, preparing food, or shaping wood during repairs. Weapons and tools often overlapped in Viking culture. An axe could split firewood one moment and defend a ship the next. The thought adds a quiet tension to the peaceful scene around you. The crew sleeps calmly, yet the tools of violence remain within arm's reach. The longship itself drifts steadily through the dark water. The thin ice plates you noticed earlier continue sliding along the hull now and then, producing soft scraping sounds before disappearing into the darkness behind the vessel. The watchmen remain silent at the bow, their eyes moving slowly across the water, One shifts his stance and adjusts the strap of a sword hanging at his side. The blade rests in a simple scabbard, its hilt rising above the sailor's belt. Even during watch duty, the weapon stays ready. Historical accounts from early medieval chronicles suggest that Viking crews were always aware of the possibility of sudden encounters during voyages. Rival groups, coastal defences, or even opportunistic raiders could appear unexpectedly along certain travel routes. Carrying weapons at all times was simply common sense. Tonight the fjord appears empty, yet the habit remains. Another sailor along the bench line opens his eyes briefly when a plank creaks beneath the changing temperature. His hand drifts instinctively toward the knife at his belt before he relaxes again. You begin to understand that this is not fear, it is preparation. Generations of sailors learned that the sea could change quickly. A quiet night might remain peaceful until morning, or it might shift without warning. There remains some disagreement among historians about how frequently Viking crews actually faced combat while travelling. Some scholars argue that violent encounters may have been less common than popular stories suggest. Others point to sagas and foreign records describing numerous clashes along trade routes and coastlines. Whatever the exact number, the sailors aboard this ship clearly believe in staying ready. You glance again along the benches. Axes, knives, spears, small shields hanging along the rail. Each item rests quietly beside its owner, forming a silent line of readiness across the length of the ship. The crew continues sleeping lightly. One man shifts his shoulders and murmurs something quietly, before settling deeper into his cloak. Another adjusts the fur across his knees. A faint snore rises from somewhere near the middle of the vessel. Despite the presence of weapons, the atmosphere remains calm. These tools are not symbols of aggression tonight. They are simply part of life aboard the Longship. Above you, the stars continue shining in sharp clarity through the cold northern air. The mast stands tall against the sky, its bundled sail hanging motionless in the stillness. The helmsman remains steady at the stern, guiding the ship through the dark water with patient hands. And all along the benches, the crew rests with weapons beside them, prepared for whatever the frozen Viking night might decide to bring. The night continues, stretching quietly across the fjord, and the Longship glides through the dark water with steady patience. Around you, the crew remains wrapped in furs and wool, their bodies folded along the benches in careful positions that balance rest with readiness. The watchmen still scan the horizon, and the helmsman holds his post near the stern. Above all of you, the sail hangs like a silent curtain. It rests tightly bundled against the mast, its thick wool cloth folded and secured with rope so the night wind cannot catch it. In the faint moonlight, the sail appears almost like a shadow drifting above the ship, unmoving yet quietly present. You lean your head back slightly and study it. Sails used on Viking longships were typically made from woven wool, rather than lighter fabrics such as linen. Wool sails were strong, flexible, and capable of handling powerful winds, though they were also heavy and required careful maintenance. Fragments of preserved Viking sails discovered in Scandinavian sites show complex weaving patterns that helped reinforce the cloth against tearing. Some sails were even treated with mixtures of animal fat or fish oil to improve their ability to resist water and wind. The sail above you tonight is enormous when you think about it. During the day, it spreads wide like the wing of a giant bird, pulling the Longship forward across open water. Now it rests quietly overhead, folded into thick layers that sway gently with the movement of the mast. A curious observation made by maritime historians studying reconstructed Viking ships revealed that sails often required constant repair. Exposure to wind salt and weather slowly weakened the fibres. Crew members frequently carried needles and spare thread so they could mend damaged sections whenever time allowed. You glance toward the bundle again, imagining dozens of careful stitches holding that cloth together. Without it, the ship would lose one of its most powerful tools. The night air continues, growing colder. Several sailors shift in their sleep, adjusting cloaks or pulling fur coverings closer around their bodies. A faint snore drifts from somewhere near the middle of the ship before fading into the quiet. Your own eyes grow heavy. The steady rhythm of the ship makes it easy to drift into thought. The creaking of wood, the distant whisper of water against the hull, the quiet breathing of the crew all blend together into a gentle pattern. It becomes almost hypnotical. You close your eyes for a moment. Behind your eyelids, the darkness feels warm compared to the cold air touching your face. Your thoughts begin to wander, slowly drifting like the ship itself across the calm fjord. Perhaps this is how many sailors spent their nights. Not fully asleep, not fully awake, floating somewhere in between. A lesser-known detail recorded in Norse sagas describes how sailors sometimes dreamed of land while travelling long distances at sea. After weeks surrounded by nothing but water and sky, the mind can become strangely focused on memories of forests, farms, and villages left behind. You imagine what those dreams might feel like. The smell of wood smoke from a distant hearth, the warmth of a crowded longhouse, the sound of wind moving through pine trees instead of sails. For the men resting along these benches, those memories might appear during moments like this when exhaustion softens the edges of consciousness. Your eyes open again slowly, nonchalantly. The stars remain sharp above the mast. The sail still hangs to the sound of the night. The longship creaks softly as another small ripple passes beneath the hull. There is still some uncertainty among historians about how frequently Viking crews travelled during the darkest hours of night rather than anchoring along shorelines. Some scholars believe sailors preferred coastal navigation with regular stops, while others suggest that experienced crews sometimes continued moving through the night when conditions were calm. Tonight's voyage appears to be one of those quieter journeys. The fjord remains calm. No storms, no sudden waves, only the steady glide of the ship beneath the frozen sky. Near the bow, one of the watchmen stretches his shoulders before returning his gaze to the horizon. His breath forms a pale cloud that lingers briefly in the air before fading. The helmsman shifts his grip on the steering oar, again adjusting the angle slightly as the current nudges the vessel. Even in calm water, the sea always moves. You settle deeper into your cloak. The sail above you sways gently with the mast, its heavy folds whispering faintly whenever the ship rocks. It feels almost like a shelter, though it provides no real protection from the cold air drifting across the deck. Still, its presence adds something comforting to the scene. A reminder that when morning comes, that silent curtain will rise again. Wind will fill its fibres, the longship will gather speed, and the crew resting beneath it now will return to their places along the oars, pushing the vessel once more across the endless northern sea. For now, though, the sail sleeps, and beneath it the crew drifts quietly through the frozen Viking night. The longship continues its slow passage through the frozen fjord, rocking gently with the patient rhythm of the sea. Most of the crew remains wrapped in their cloaks along the benches, drifting somewhere between sleep and quiet awareness. A few men shift occasionally to warm, stiff limbs. The watchmen remain at the bow, their silhouettes steady against the dim glow of the sky. The night feels deeper now, colder too. And in that deep silence, new sounds begin to appear. You hear it first as a faint splash somewhere off the side of the ship. It is not the scrape of drifting ice like before. This sound carries a different rhythm. Water breaks the surface, then settles again. Splash! The watchman nearest the rail leans slightly forward and looks down into the dark water. For a moment you see nothing, then another ripple spreads across the surface beside the hull. Something is moving below. Excavations and historical studies of Viking voyages reveal that sailors frequently encountered marine life during long journeys along northern coasts. Whales, seals, and large schools of fish often travelled through the same waters that Viking ships used for navigation. To sailors accustomed to the sea, these visitors were not unusual. Still, encountering them in the darkness adds a certain mystery. The watchman watches the water quietly for several seconds before relaxing again. Whatever passed beneath the ship does not appear threatening. You lean slightly toward the rail yourself and peer into the water. The fjord reflects the moon and stars so clearly that the surface almost looks solid. Beneath that mirror, however, the sea remains full of hidden movement. Another ripple appears. This time a small shape breaks the surface briefly before disappearing again. Perhaps a seal. Seals were common along Scandinavian coasts, and Norse communities hunted them for meat, oil, and fur. The animals often followed fishing areas where food was plentiful. The sailor beside you notices the movement as well. He lifts his head slightly from his cloak, glances toward the water, then lowers his head again. Nothing unusual, just the sea going about its business. A small but fascinating note recorded in medieval writings mentions that sailors sometimes interpreted unusual sea creatures as signs or omens during long voyages. Strange animals appearing near the ship might be seen as warnings, blessings, or simply curiosities, depending on the crew's beliefs. Tonight the visitors seem harmless. The longship glides forward while faint splashes occasionally echo across the dark water. You notice the watchmen paying closer attention now, though not with fear. Their eyes move carefully across the surface whenever a ripple appears, listening, watching. Their senses remain tuned to the world around them. The hull creaks softly as another piece of drifting ice brushes against the side before sliding away. The sound of water moving beneath the ship grows more noticeable as the night continues. Without wind or voices to compete with it, the quiet movements of the fjord become almost musical. Whisper, splash, whisper again. You begin to realize that sailors who spend long months at sea must learn to interpret these sounds instinctively. Every splash could mean fish, some fish, or drifting ice, or something far larger moving beneath the surface. Some historians suggest that experienced Viking sailors developed an extraordinary awareness of their surroundings while at sea. Without modern instruments or lighting crews depended heavily on their senses to detect changes in weather currents and nearby activity. Listening carefully might reveal the presence of rocks hidden below the surface, or approaching ships beyond the darkness, or simply the quiet life of the sea itself. Another splash breaks the stillness. This time the ripple appears farther away from the hull, spreading across the moonlit surface like a widening ring. One of the watchmen follows it with his eyes until it disappears. Then he resumes scanning the horizon. Life continues moving through the fjord all around you. Fish dart through the water. Seals glide silently beneath the surface. Perhaps even larger creatures travel through deeper channels nearby. A curious observation from Norse folklore describes encounters with enormous sea animals that modern readers often interpret as exaggerated stories of whales. Sailors sometimes reported vast shapes rising from the ocean beside their ships large enough to terrify an entire crew. Whether those tales were true sightings or the product of imagination remains uncertain. Standing here tonight, staring into the dark water, you begin to understand how easily such stories might form. The sea reveals very little of itself after sunset. Most of what exists beneath the surface remains hidden. The watchmen continue their quiet vigilance. The helmsman maintains his steady position at the stern. Along the benches, the rest of the crew sleeps lightly, their weapons and cloaks close at hand. And beneath the longship, unseen creatures glide silently through the freezing waters of the fjord, sharing the night with the drifting vessel and its tired crew. The small ripples beside the ship slowly fade and the fjord returns to its deep stillness. The creatures that brushed past the hull vanish again into the dark water, leaving only faint circles that widen across the moonlit surface before disappearing completely. The watchmen at the bow relax their posture slightly, satisfied that nothing unusual lingers near the vessel. For a time, the ship moves forward in silence. Then, somewhere along the benches behind you, a quiet voice begins speaking. It is low enough that it does not disturb the sleeping crew, yet close enough that you can hear it clearly if you listen. One sailor has shifted upright, his cloak still wrapped around his shoulders, and he is speaking softly to another man beside him. They are telling a story. At first you catch only fragments, a name, a place, something about a journey across rough seas. The words drift across the deck in a gentle murmur, blending with the creaking wood and whispering water. Storytelling filled an important role in Norse culture. Long before written records became common in Scandinavia, stories carried history, belief, and entertainment from one generation to the next. Tales of gods, explorers, warriors, and strange creatures traveled through memory and voice rather than ink. Even sailors crossing dark water sometimes pass the time with quiet stories like this. The voice continues calm and steady. You hear mention of Thor's hammer striking a giant across the sky. Then the name of Odin appears spoken with quiet respect. The sailor pauses briefly, perhaps choosing his next words carefully before continuing the tale. The story does not sound dramatic the way modern entertainment might present it. There is no shouting or dramatic gestures. Instead, the sailor speaks slowly, almost rhythmically, as if the words themselves are meant to flow gently through the cold night air. A small but fascinating detail preserved in Norse literature is that many sagas were originally performed aloud before they were ever written down. Skilled storytellers could recite long narratives from memory, sometimes lasting hours. Their voices carried the traditions and legends of entire communities. Listening now, you can imagine how such storytelling might feel inside a warm longhouse during winter. Tonight, however, the stage is the narrow deck of a ship surrounded by black water and frozen air. The sailor describing Thor's battles shifts slightly on his bench as he continues. His companion listens quietly, occasionally nodding, or offering a brief reply in a low voice. Other crew members nearby remain asleep. Perhaps they have heard this story before. Perhaps they are too tired to listen. Still the words drift softly across the deck, Thor lifting his hammer. Giants challenging the gods, storms crashing across distant seas. The longship creaks gently as another ripple slides beneath the hull. The storyteller pauses for a moment, glances toward the watchman at the bow, then resumes speaking. He seems careful not to raise his voice. Even storytelling must respect the quiet discipline of a ship at night. A curious element within Norse mythology is the strong connection between gods and natural forces. Thunder belonged to Thor. Wisdom and prophecy belonged to Odin. The sea itself often appeared within stories as both a pathway and a danger. For sailors crossing cold waters under uncertain skies, these myths may have carried extra meaning. The storyteller's voice grows softer now as he reaches the end of his tale. A brief chuckle escapes from his companion before both men settle deeper into their cloaks. For a moment, the deck becomes silent again. Then another voice rises briefly from farther down the benches. This one is quieter still, almost a whisper. You cannot hear the entire story, but you catch a few scattered details. A trader who lost his cargo during a storm, a village feast after a successful voyage, a strange bird seen flying far out at sea. These small fragments feel less like legends and more like memories, stories of real journeys. There remains some discussion among historians about how often Viking sailors used storytelling during actual voyages. While sagas clearly formed an important cultural tradition, the exhausting labour of rowing and navigation may have limited how frequently long tales were told aboard ships. Shorter stories shared during the quiet moments like this, however, seem entirely possible. The longship glides onward beneath the stars. The cold air continues pressing against the deck. A faint breeze moves across the bundled sail, producing a soft rustling sound high above the crew. Below it, the sailors drift gradually back towards sleep. The storyteller pulls his cloak tighter and lowers his head, perhaps satisfied that his tale has passed another few quiet minutes of the long night. Soon even his voice disappears. Only the sounds of the ship remain. The creaking ribs of oak, the whisper of water sliding along the hull, and the distant memory of story. Always drifting across the frozen sea. The last murmurs of storytelling fade into the cold night air, and the deck of the longship returns to its quiet rhythm. The sailors along the benches settle deeper into their cloaks, their breathing slow and steady beneath the pale light of the stars. The fjord stretches endlessly around the vessel, its dark surface broken only by occasional ripples and drifting fragments of ice. Near the stern, however, one man remains fully awake, the helmsman. While many of the crew drift between sleep and light rest, the responsibility of guiding the ship belongs to him. His position beside the long steering oar demands patience and constant attention, even during calm nights like this one. You glance toward him and notice the way he stands with a steady balance, feet planted carefully against the shifting deck. One hand rests firmly on the long wooden handle of the steering oar, while the other occasionally adjusts his cloak against the cold wind. The steering oar itself is an impressive piece of equipment. Unlike the central rudders found on modern ships, Viking longships relied on a large side-mounted oar, positioned along the starboard side near the stern. This long blade extended into the water, allowing the helmsman to guide the vessel by adjusting its angle against the current. Archaeological excavations of well-preserved ships such as the Gokstad vessel reveal the presence of these steering oars, along with the carved fittings that secured them to the hull. The design allowed the helmsman to control the ship effectively, even in rough seas. Watching the man at the stern tonight, you realise how much quiet skill this task requires. The water looks calm, yet the ship never truly stops moving. Small currents shift beneath the hull, The breeze changes direction slightly from time to time. Even the weight of the crew along the benches influences how the vessel sits in the water. The helmsman senses these changes through the steering oar. Every small movement travels through the wood into his hands. He adjusts the angle slightly. The ship responds. Another quiet correction follows a moment later. The longship continues gliding forward through the darkness. A curious observation made by researchers who sailed reconstructed Viking ships is that experienced helmsmen often relied more on feel than sight when guiding the vessel. The pressure of water against the steering oar could reveal subtle changes in direction or speed that were difficult to detect visually in low light. Standing here now, the helmsman seems almost connected to the sea through that long wooden handle. You watch as he leans his weight, slightly easing the oar to one side before bringing it back again. The movement is gentle, almost effortless, yet the entire ship responds. Far ahead, the watchmen remain at the bow scanning the dark horizon. Occasionally, one of them shifts position or glances toward the helmsman, maintaining silent communication across the length of the vessel. No words are needed. Each man understands his role. A thin gust of wind sweeps across the deck, rustling the bundled sail above the mast. The helmsman lifts his head briefly, studying the movement of the cloth before returning his attention to the water. The wind fades again. Only the slow rocking of the hull remains. There is still some scholarly discussion regarding how long individual sailors might remain at the helm during nighttime travel. Some historians believe the task rotated among experienced crew members, while others suggest that certain individuals served regularly as helmsmen due to their skill and familiarity with navigation. Watching this man tonight, it seems clear that experience matters. His movements carry confidence. He never looks rushed, never uncertain. Even when the ship creaks sharply as another thin plate of ice brushes against the hull, he does not react with alarm. Instead, he makes a small adjustment to the steering oar and continues guiding the vessel through the fjord. You notice the muscles in his forearm shifting beneath the wool of his cloak. Holding the heavy steering oar for hours must require strength as well as patience. One sailor along the nearby bench lifts his head briefly and glances toward the stern before returning to sleep. The helmsman does not acknowledge the movement. His attention remains fixed on the dark water behind and beside the ship. Above him, the stars form a wide arc across the sky. The mast rises through that pattern like a silent pillar. The bundled sail sways gently with each motion of the longship. And there at the very back of the vessel, the helmsman continues his quiet vigil while the rest of the crew sleeps. His hands never leave the steering oar. His eyes never stop studying the water. Because on a Viking longship, even during the coldest hours of night, someone must remain awake to guide the ship safely through the endless darkness of the sea. The night grows colder in a way that feels almost invisible at first. There is no sudden no dramatic gust of icy wind sweeping across the fjord. Instead, the temperature slips downward, slowly settling deeper into the ship with every passing minute. You notice it in the way the sailors shift beneath their cloaks, in the way your breath links longer in the air before fading, and in the way the sea itself begins leaving traces behind. You first see it along the ropes. Thin white crystals appear where moisture has settled on the fibres. The rigging stretches from the mast to the edges of the ship like a web, and along those strands frost has begun forming quietly. Each tiny thread of ice catches the faint light of the stars. Above you, the bundled sail hangs heavy and still. Its thick wool cloth absorbs moisture from the air, and the cold begins stiffening the outer folds. The fabric does not freeze solid, but it grows heavier and less flexible as frost gathers along its edges. Maritime archaeology shows that Viking ships operating in northern waters often faced freezing conditions like these. The combination of cold air and sea spray could coat parts of the vessel with frost or ice during long winter voyages. Crew members needed to remain aware of these changes because accumulated ice could alter the balance and movement of the ship. You glance down toward the deck. The wooden planks are beginning to show a faint white sheen as well. At first, it looks like little more than dampness reflecting moonlight. But when one sailor shifts his boot slightly, the sole makes a quiet scraping sound across the surface. Frost. A thin layer has formed across parts of the deck. The sailor notices it too. He lifts his foot, rubs it briefly against the rough wood of the bench leg beside him, then settles again into his cloak. No alarm, just quiet awareness. Another sign appears along the side of the hull. A small wave rolls gently against the longship, sending a thin splash upward along the planks. Normally, the water would slide back down immediately. Tonight, however, a delicate crust of ice begins forming where the spray touches the cold wood. The transformation happens slowly but clearly. Droplets become crystals. Crystals become thin patches of ice. You reach out and touch the railing carefully. The wood feels colder than before, and when your fingers brush the surface, they pick up a faint dusting of frost. A surprising observation made by researchers who sailed replica Viking vessels through northern waters revealed that ice could accumulate on ropes, shields, and deck surfaces during extended exposure to freezing air. Crews often needed to knock away the ice regularly to keep equipment functioning properly. Looking around the ship now, you can see how easily that process might begin. The ropes glisten faintly. The shields hanging along the rail show a thin white edge, where frost has settled on their rims. Even the beards of a few sailors carry tiny specks of ice where breath has frozen against the hair. One man near the bow lifts a hand to his beard and brushes away the crystals with a quiet chuckle, before pulling his cloak tighter. The watchmen remain alert despite the cold. One stamps his boots gently against the deck to keep circulation flowing through his legs. The other pulls his fur collar higher around his neck, while continuing to scan the dark horizon. The helmsman at the stern does not move much at all. He stands steady beside the steering oar, his breath forming slow clouds that drift across the air before vanishing. The fjord itself has grown eerily calm. Thin fragments of ice drift past the hull now and then, scraping lightly against the planks before sliding away behind the ship. The sound is faint but distinct, like glass brushing gently across wood. There remains some discussion among historians about how frequently Viking ships sailed during the harshest winter conditions. Some scholars believe most long-distance voyages occurred during warmer seasons, while others point to evidence suggesting that experienced crews sometimes travelled even in colder months when circumstances demanded it. Standing here tonight, wrapped in layers of wool while frost creeps across the deck, it becomes easier to imagine just how challenging those journeys must have been. The cold presses inward from every direction. Air, water, wood. Yet the longship continues moving forward through the frozen night. The hull flexes softly with the current. The mast sways slightly beneath the weight of the bundled sail. The crew sleeps or keeps watch as the vessel carries them through dark water dotted with drifting ice. And slowly, almost quietly, the longship begins wearing the frozen fingerprints of the northern sea. Frost on the ropes, ice along the rails, crystals forming in beards and cloaks, signs that the night has grown colder still. The frost creeping across the ropes and rails continues spreading slowly as the night deepens. The longship carries its quiet crew through the dark fjord while the cold presses steadily against woodcloth and skin. Your cloak traps what warmth it can, but the air around you feels sharper than it did even an hour ago. The ship moves calmly, yet there is something about the stillness that makes the watchman a little more alert. Cold nights at sea often bring an uneasy kind of quiet. You notice one of the men near the bow lifting his gaze toward the horizon again and again. His eyes sweep across the dark water, searching for any change in the sky or the waves. The other watchman does the same, though more slowly. Their behaviour hints at a simple truth. Calm weather can change quickly. Maritime studies of Viking-era navigation show that sailors relied heavily on observing the sky and sea conditions to anticipate shifts in weather. Without modern instruments, the appearance of clouds, the behaviour of wind, and even the pattern of waves could signal the approach of a storm. Tonight the sky appears clear. Stars stretch from horizon to horizon, bright and sharp into the freezing air. The moon glows softly above the fjord, casting pale light across the drifting ice and the longship's narrow deck. Still the watchman keeps scanning. One of them lifts his hand and rubs his beard slowly, watching the northern sky as if expecting something to appear there. You follow his gaze. Nothing yet. Just stars. But sailors learn patience when it comes to weather. A curious note recorded in early medieval writings describes how Norse sailors sometimes paid close attention to subtle signs in the sky, long before storms actually appeared. A faint halo around the moon, a shift in the direction of distant clouds, or an unusual calm across the water could all hint at changing conditions. You look again toward the horizon. The fjord remains quiet. The air is cold enough that your breath forms thick clouds drifting upward with every exhale. Frost continues gathering along the ropes and rails. The deck glitters faintly where ice crystals have formed across the planks. One of the watchmen suddenly lifts his chin slightly, not alarmed, just attentive. Far to the west, a faint blur appears near the edge of the sky. At first, it is difficult to see clearly. The moonlight makes the horizon bright enough that distant shapes blend into the background. But after a moment, you realize the blur is a thin band of cloud moving slowly above the fjord. The watchman studies it carefully. Then he glances towards the helmsman at the stern. No words pass between them, yet the message seems clear enough. The helmsman nods once and adjusts the steering oar, slightly guiding the ship a little farther from the shoreline. Perhaps he prefers deeper water if the weather changes. Perhaps it is simply routine caution. There is still debate among historians regarding how far ahead Viking sailors could predict storms using only natural observation. Some researchers believe experienced crews developed remarkable skill at reading environmental signs, while others argue that sudden storms likely caught many ships by surprise despite careful watching. Standing here beneath the cold stars, you can see why prediction might be difficult. The sky looks peaceful. The water moves gently. Nothing about the scene suggests violent weather approaching, and yet the sailors remain alert. Another faint breeze passes across the deck, rustling the bundled sail high above your head. The cloth shifts slightly before settling again. You notice the watchman glance up at it. Wind direction matters. A stronger gust would cause the sail bundle to move more dramatically. For now it remains calm. One sailor along the benches stirs and opens his eyes briefly. He glances toward the bow, perhaps noticing the watchman studying the horizon before closing his eyes again. The crew trust the men on watch. If danger appears, they will be warned. The helmsman adjusts his stance once more, stretching his shoulders before resting both hands on the steering oar again. The longship continues gliding across the fjord. Clouds remain distant on the horizon. The stars above still shine clearly, and though the possibility of a storm always lingers somewhere beyond the dark water tonight, the frozen sea holds its calm. For now, the faint band of clouds on the horizon drifts slowly across the sky, but the stars above the longship remain bright and steady. The watchmen at the bow continue their quiet observation for a while longer, before relaxing slightly again. Whatever weather might be forming far away will not reach the ship anytime soon. For now the sky's clear, and for sailors travelling across dark water, a clear sky offers something extremely valuable. Direction. You lean back slightly on the bench and look upward, letting your eyes follow the stars stretching across the night. Without modern compasses or glowing navigation screens, the sky above serves as a guide that sailors have trusted for thousands of years. Evidence preserved in Viking navigation traditions suggests that Norse sailors used the sun stars and coastline landmarks to maintain their direction during long voyages. Experienced navigators learned to recognize the star patterns that rose and set in predictable locations along the horizon. Those patterns became silent markers in the sky. You notice the helmsman occasionally glancing upward as he guides the ship. His gaze lingers on a cluster of bright stars before returning to the water ahead. It is possible he is using them as reference points. One intriguing clue discovered by historians studying Viking navigation is the existence of objects sometimes called sunstones. These crystals, possibly made of calcite, may have helped sailors locate the position of the sun even when clouds obscured it. By analysing how light passed through the crystal, a navigator could estimate where the sun sat in the sky. At night, however, the stars themselves became the guide. The watchman near the bow raises a hand briefly and points toward the sky before lowering it again. The gesture is subtle but noticeable. Perhaps he is confirming the ship's direction with the helmsman. No conversation follows. Both men simply return their attention to their duties. The fjord glows faintly under the moonlight, its dark surface reflecting the stars in broken fragments whenever small ripples pass beneath the hull. You try to imagine memorizing the sky the way ancient sailors did, each star rising in the east, each constellation drifting westward as the hours pass. Even without charts or instruments, those patterns could guide a ship across enormous distances if the navigator knew how to read them. A small but fascinating observation recorded in Icelandic sagas describes sailors who could identify the direction of travel simply by watching how certain stars moved across the sky during the night. Over time, those celestial patterns became familiar companions on long sea journeys. Tonight, the sky offers a perfect view. The cold air has pushed away nearly all clouds overhead, leaving the stars bright and sharp above the mast. The bundled sail sways gently beneath that glittering ceiling. The watchmen occasionally glance upward between their scans of the horizon. The helmsman does the same. It is a quiet partnership between sea and sky. You begin noticing how slowly the stars move. At first they appear fixed in place, but after watching for several minutes, you realize that certain ones have shifted slightly relative to the mast. Time is passing. The night is turning. There remains ongoing discussion among historians regarding exactly how advanced Viking navigation techniques may have been during open ocean voyages. Some scholars believe Norse sailors relied mostly on coastal landmarks and careful observation of the sea itself. Others argue that star knowledge allowed experienced navigators to travel far beyond sight of land with surprising accuracy. Either way, the sky clearly played an important role. Tonight, the longship drifts beneath that ancient map of light. The helmsman adjusts the steering oar slightly, responding to a gentle push from the current. The blade of the oar moves through the water with a quiet swirl before settling again. The watchman continues scanning the dark horizon. The crew along the benches remains mostly asleep, their cloaks rising and falling with steady breaths. And above all of you, the stars slowly turn across the sky, guiding the longship through the frozen waters of the fjord without a single spoken instruction. The night the sea and the sky all move together, and the ship follows their silent path. The stars continue their slow movement across the sky, while the longship glides through the frozen fjord. The night has grown deep enough that time feels almost suspended. The crew along the benches sleeps in uneven rhythms, some breathing steadily, others stirring now and then when the cold presses too sharply through their cloaks. You remain seated where you settled earlier, knees slightly bent against the narrow space of the bent shoulders, tucked inside layers of wool. It takes time to understand what the night truly feels like on a vessel this small. Because the most noticeable thing is not the cold, it is the closeness. You glance along the row of benches and see how tightly everyone fits together. Each sailor occupies a narrow section of wood, no wider than a modest chair. The distance between one man and the next is often no more than the length of a forearm. Personal space, as people think of it today, simply does not exist here. Archaeological studies of Viking longships reveal just how narrow these vessels were relative to the size of their crews. A ship capable of carrying 40 or more men might measure only a few meters across at its widest point. The design prioritized speed and flexibility rather than comfort, which means every inch of space had to be shared. You notice how the sailors adjust themselves to accommodate this reality. One man sits slightly forward so his shoulders do not press into the person behind him. Another curls his legs beneath a cloak so his boots do not extend into the aisle between benches. Movements become careful and deliberate. A small shift from one sailor often causes the person beside him to shift as well. The ship feels less like a collection of individuals and more like a single sleeping organism. A faint snore begins somewhere along the benches behind you. The sound grows a little louder before stopping abruptly when the sleeper adjusts position. A quiet chuckle escapes from another sailor nearby, though he quickly hides the smile beneath his cloak. Even small sounds travel easily in such tight quarters. The closeness creates a strange sense of familiarity among the crew. You can hear each man's breathing, you can feel the heat of bodies sitting just inches away. Occasionally a shoulder brushes lightly against yours when the ship rocks. At first it feels uncomfortable, but over time the mind begins adjusting to it. Life aboard a longship simply demands cooperation with the limited space. A small but interesting detail uncovered in Viking settlements suggests that communal living was already a normal part of daily life long before sailors stepped aboard ships. Many Norse families lived together inside longhouses where multiple people shared sleeping areas around a central hearth. For sailors raised in that environment, sleeping shoulder to shoulder on a ship might not have felt especially unusual. Still, the narrow deck creates its own challenges. One sailor near the center of the ship tries to stretch his legs briefly before realizing there is nowhere to extend them fully. With a quiet sigh, he bends them again and settles back into his cloak. Another lifts his arm to scratch his beard, accidentally brushing the shoulder of the man beside him. No complaint follows, just a small shift of position and silence returns. The watchmen at the bow remain alert, though their posture appears relaxed now that the sky remains clear and the fjord calm. One leans lightly against the rail while scanning the dark water. The helmsman continues holding the steering oar at the stern. The rest of the crew rests within a shared warmth created by their closeness. Despite the cold air drifting across the deck, the presence of so many bodies in such a confined space actually provides a small advantage. Heat radiates outward from each sailor, forming a subtle pocket of warmth along the benches. Not enough to feel comfortable, but enough to help endure the freezing night. Researchers who have studied reconstructed Viking voyages sometimes mention how quickly crews become accustomed to living in tight quarters. After only a few days at sea, sailors begin adjusting their movements instinctively to avoid disturbing one another. The human body adapts remarkably well to shared space when necessary. You see that adaptation clearly here. A sailor shifts slightly and leans his shoulder against the rib of the ship behind him. Another tilts his head forward so his cloak forms a small shelter around his face. Everyone finds a position that works. There remains ongoing discussion among historians regarding the social dynamics aboard Viking ships during long expeditions. Some scholars suggest that strong bonds likely formed between crew members due to the intense cooperation required during travel. Others point out that such close living conditions may also have created tensions at times. Both possibilities seem reasonable. Tonight, however, the crew appears united by something simpler: exhaustion, cold, and the shared goal of reaching morning safely. The longship creaks softly as another ripple passes beneath the hull. The motion travels through the benches, gently shifting the sleeping sailors in small synchronized movements. For a moment it feels as if the entire crew breathes together, wrapped in wool, pressed shoulder to shoulder, drifting through the frozen night on a narrow vessel where every inch of space belongs to everyone. The slow breathing of the crew continues along the benches as the longship moves through the frozen fjord. Frost glimmers faintly along the rails and the stars above remain sharp against the dark sky. The cold air presses gently against every exposed surface, yet the quiet closeness of the sailors creates a strange sense of warmth across the deck. For a while nothing changes, then a faint sound drifts through the night. At first you think it might be wind brushing the sail, but the bundled cloth above remains mostly still. The sound comes again, soft and low, carrying a steady rhythm that rises and falls with the rocking of the ship. Someone is humming. The sailor sits a few benches away, wrapped in his cloak with his chin tucked low against the cold. His voice barely rises above the whisper of the water. It is not really a song yet, just a melody shaped quietly in the back of his throat. The notes drift across the deck like meh. No one tells him to stop. No one complains. In fact, another sailor farther along the benches quietly joins him, adding a second voice that blends into the first. The sound remains gentle enough not to wake the sleepers nearby. Evidence preserved in Norse cultural traditions shows that music and chanting played a role in many aspects of Viking life. Songs accompanied work, storytelling, celebrations, and long journeys. Simple melodies were easy to remember and could pass from one person to another without written words. Out here on the dark water, a quiet song feels almost natural. The two sailors continue humming for a moment before the first voice begins forming actual words. They are not loud enough for you to catch every line clearly, but the rhythm carries easily through the still night air. It sounds slow, almost soothing. You notice the watchman at the bow turning his head slightly toward the sound. His expression does not change, but he listens for a moment before returning his gaze to the horizon. The helmsman at the stern also seems to hear it. One corner of his mouth lifts briefly before his attention returns to guiding the ship. The melody drifts over the water. It is not a grand performance. There are no dramatic notes or complicated rhythms. Instead, the voices move gently through the cold air, following the slow motion of the vessel itself. Up, down, up again. A fascinating detail preserved in some medieval descriptions suggests that rowing crews sometimes use rhythmic chants to help coordinate their movements during long hours of labour. The steady beat of a song could help dozens of rowers pull their oars in unison. Tonight there are no oars moving through the water. Still, the rhythm of the melody echoes the same steady pattern. The sailors singing seem almost half asleep as they continue. One voice carries the melody while the other follows softly behind. Their cloaks hide most of their faces, leaving only the faint rise of breath visible in the cold air. The sound travels farther than you might expect. Across the quiet water, the melody floats outward from the ship before dissolving into the night. For a few moments, the longship becomes more than just wooden rope drifting across the fjord. It becomes a small island of human voices surrounded by endless dark water. Another sailor shifts slightly along the benches and adds a few low notes of his own before drifting back towards silence. The song continues for a while longer, then it fades. The first singer stops humming and pulls his cloak higher around his chin. His companion exhales slowly, the last trace of melody disappearing with his breath. Silence returns. Only the creaking hull and whispering water remain. There remains some uncertainty among historians about how frequently sailors sang during actual voyages. Hard labour and harsh weather might have limited such moments, yet the strong musical traditions of Norse culture suggest that songs likely appeared whenever the crew found a quiet opportunity. Tonight appears to be one of those rare quiet moments. The watchman resumes scanning the dark horizon. The helmsman steadies the steering oar again. Along the benches, most of the crew remains asleep, unaware that a soft song just drifted across the deck beneath the stars. The longship glides forward through the frozen night, and somewhere behind you the last echo of that melody still seems to linger quietly in the cold air above the sea. The quiet melody fades completely, leaving the longship once again wrapped in the natural sounds of night. Water brushes gently against the hull. Frost clings to the ropes. The sky remains bright with stars that shimmer above the mast. Most of the crew continues resting along the benches, wrapped tightly in cloaks and furs. A few sailors stir now and then, adjusting their positions or pulling their coverings closer against the cold air. Then a faint snapping sound breaks the stillness. It comes from somewhere near the middle of the ship. At first, the noise is so small that it might easily be mistaken for another plank adjusting in the cold. But the helmsman lifts his head immediately, and one of the watchmen glances back from the bow. Someone has noticed it. A sailor near the mast sits upright and leans forward to examine a coil of rope lying beside his bench. He lifts it slowly, turning it in his hands while inspecting the fibres in the dim moonlight. Another short snapping sound follows as he pulls gently on one section. The rope is fraying. Surviving Viking ships and maritime equipment discovered through archaeological excavations reveal that ropes were essential components of longship operation. Rigging lines, controlled sails, secured cargo-fastened equipment, and supported many structural elements aboard the vessel. When a rope began weakening, it needed attention quickly. The sailor studying the line gestures quietly toward another crew member nearby. The second man wakes with a slow blink before leaning forward to look at the damaged section. No alarm spreads across the ship, just calm. Focus. Both sailors begin working with careful movements, trying not to disturb the rest of the crew. One pulls a small knife from his belt and trims away loose fibres. The other retrieves a shorter length of spare rope from beneath the bench. They begin tying a repair. The knots form slowly in the cold air, their fingers stiff but practiced. Even in the dim light, their hands move with confidence. A curious detail uncovered in Viking ship finds is the presence of numerous rope fragments made from materials such as hemp flax or animal hair. These fibres were twisted together to create strong lines capable of withstanding the strain of sails and rigging. However, constant exposure to salt water and wind gradually weakened them, which means repairs like this were probably common. The sailor holding the knife finishes trimming of the damaged section before passing the line to his companion. The second man loops the replacement cord, carefully forming a tight knot that pulls the fibres together again. The rope creaks softly as tension returns to the line. Both sailors pause for a moment, testing the repair. Satisfied, they coil the rope neatly and return it beside the mast. The entire process takes only a few minutes. Across the deck, most of the crew never even wakes. The watchman at the bow glances back once more before returning his attention to the dark water ahead. The helmsman continues guiding the ship with steady hands. You realise how quietly necessary these small tasks must have been during long voyages. A ship travelling across unpredictable seas could not afford to ignore even minor equipment problems. Every rope mattered, every knot mattered. There is ongoing discussion among maritime historians regarding how much time Viking crews spent maintaining their ships while travelling. Some researchers believe that sailors likely performed constant small repairs during the quiet moments, rather than waiting for major damage to occur. Watching the sailors tonight, that idea feels very believable. Preventing problems would always be easier than solving them during a storm. The two men who repaired the rope settle back into their benches. One tucks the knife back into his belt before pulling his cloak around his shoulders again. Within moments, both appear to drift towards sleep. The rope remains secured beside the mast. The longship creaks softly as another ripple passes beneath the hull. Frost continues spreading along the rails and ropes. Above it all, the stars remain bright against the northern skew. The ship glides onward through the cold water, carrying a crew that understands one simple truth about life at sea. Even in the quietest hours of night, the work of keeping a ship alive never truly stops. The small repair near the mast fades back into silence, and the longship resumes its quiet rhythm across the frozen fjord. Frost continues clinging to ropes and rails, sparkling faintly beneath the moonlight. Most of the crew remains wrapped in cloaks along the benches, drifting through light sleep while the vessel moves steadily through dark water. Near the centre of the ship, however, one presence seems to influence the atmosphere even while resting. The captain. You notice him a few benches forward, seated slightly apart from the tight clusters of rowers. His cloak is pulled high around his shoulders and his head leans back against one of the ship's ribs. At first glance he appears no different from the others, but the subtle space around him tells a different story. No one crowds too closely. No one places gear directly beside his seat. The men near him maintain a respectful distance even while sleeping. Early Scandinavian sources and later sagas often describe the leader of a ship as the steersman or captain, who commanded both navigation and discipline during voyages. This individual was responsible not only for guiding the vessel, but also for organising the crew and making decisions about travel, trade or conflict. Authority aboard a long ship needed to be clear. Too many men sharing a narrow deck left little room for confusion. You watch the captain for a moment as the ship rocks gently beneath him, his eyes open, briefly scanning the deck in a slow practice motion. He glances toward the bow where the watchmen stand, then toward the stern where the helmsman continues guiding the ship. Satisfied, he closes his eyes again. Even resting, he seems aware of everything happening around him. A faint gust of wind passes across the deck, stirring the bundled sail above the mast. The cloth rustles quietly before settling again. The captain shifts his shoulders beneath his cloak, pulling the fabric tighter against the cold. Then he becomes still once more. A fascinating detail preserved in several Norse sagas suggests that captains often earn their authority not simply through birth, but through reputation and leadership during voyages. Successful expeditions built trust among the crew, while poor leadership could quickly damage a captain's standing. On a vessel like this, respect had practical value. The crew depended on the captain's decisions to survive. Storms navigate unfamiliar waters and manage limited supplies. Even tonight, during a calm stretch of travel, his presence shapes the behaviour of the sailors around him. One rower sitting nearby wakes briefly and glances toward the captain before adjusting his cloak and returning to sleep. The movement appears almost instinctive, as if checking that everything remains in order. Farther along the benches, another sailor shifts his position carefully to avoid bumping into the captain's space. These small gestures happen without spoken instruction. Authority exists quietly here. Near the bow, the watchman continues scanning the horizon. One briefly turns his head toward the captain, perhaps confirming that the leader remains awake enough to respond if necessary. The captain opens his eyes again for a moment. Their gazes meet across the deck. A slight nod passes between them. No words follow. Communication aboard a ship often becomes simple and efficient. The helmsman at the stern maintains his steady grip on the steering oar, occasionally adjusting the blade as the current nudges the vessel. The captain glances in that direction as well before settling back against the wooden rib. The longship continues gliding forward through the calm water. There remains ongoing discussion among historians about how formal leadership structures may have been aboard Viking ships during different periods. Some researchers believe authority may have varied depending on the purpose of the voyage, whether trade exploration or raiding. Others argue that most crews likely recognised a clear captain whose decisions carried final weight. Watching the subtle respect shown by the sailors tonight, the presence of such leadership seems likely. Without it, a crowded ship filled with armed men could easily descend into confusion. Instead, the deck remains orderly. The crew sleeps. The watchmen observe the horizon. The helmsman guides the vessel. And the captain rests lightly among them, aware that even during the quietest hours of night, the responsibility for every man aboard this longship ultimately rests with him. The cold air continues drifting across the fjord. The stars move slowly overhead. And somewhere beneath his cloak, the captain listens to the creaking wood and whispering water, ready to wake fully the moment the ship requires his command. The captain settles again into stillness, and the longship resumes its quiet passage through the frozen fjord. The crew along the benches breathe slowly beneath their cloaks, the warmth of their bodies forming small pockets of heat in the narrow spaces between them. Frost remains scattered across ropes and rails, and thin plates of ice drift occasionally along the hull before slipping away into the dark water. The night feels deep and ancient. Out here, surrounded by sea and sky, the world becomes simpler. The ship, the crew, the cold air moving across the deck, and the many small beliefs that sailors carry with them into the darkness. You notice one of the watchmen at the bow reach into a small pouch hanging from his belt. His movement is slow and careful, almost thoughtful. From the pouch he removes a tiny carved object no larger than his thumb. He studies it briefly in the moonlight. Then he closes his hand around it before returning the object to the pouch. Nothing dramatic happens afterward. He simply resumes scanning the water ahead. Yet the gesture feels meaningful. Across the Viking world, many people carried small personal items believed to offer protection or good fortune. Archaeological excavations have uncovered numerous amulets and charms shaped like animals' tools or mythological symbols. Some appear to represent Thor's hammer, while others take the form of simple carved figures. Such objects may have served as reminders of faith tradition or personal identity during dangerous journeys. For sailors travelling across unpredictable seas, even a small charm might provide comfort. You glance toward the watchman again. His hand now rests casually against the rail, but the pouch remains tied securely at his belt. The sea continues, whispering softly around the hull. Another curious detail discovered by archaeologists comes from burial sites where sailors were interred with small personal objects that had little obvious practical purpose. Some graves contain tiny carved animals or abstract shapes made from bone or wood. Scholars believe these may have functioned as protective symbols or tokens of belief carried during life. Standing on the deck tonight, it becomes easier to imagine why. The sea holds many uncertainties. Storms appear suddenly. Navigation depends on careful observation, and the darkness hides whatever may lie beneath the water. In such conditions, small rituals can feel reassuring. A sailor farther along the benches quietly touches the handle of the axe beside him before settling deeper into his cloak. The gesture happens almost unconsciously, like someone checking that a familiar object remains nearby. Perhaps it is habit, perhaps something more. Near the mast, another crew member lifts his hand briefly and traces a small symbol in the air before resting again. The motion is quick enough that you nearly miss it. Norse belief systems were complex and varied, mixing mythological traditions with everyday customs and regional practices. Symbols connected to gods such as Thor or Odin sometimes appeared on jewelry or carved objects, suggesting that spiritual ideas travelled closely with individuals wherever they went. The longship itself carries a symbol as well. You glance toward the bow where the carved dragon head rises above the water. Even in the dim light, its shape appears fierce, its wooden mouth open as if challenging the darkness ahead. The exact purpose of such carvings remains a topic of discussion among historians. Some researchers believe they may have been intended to frighten enemies or hostile spirits. Others suggest they served as decorative symbols of power and identity for the crew. Whatever the original meaning, the dragon figure certainly adds character to the ship. It seems to stare out across the frozen water as if guarding the vessel. The watchmen continue their quiet vigil beneath that carved head. One shifts his stance slightly while scanning the horizon. The helmsman at the stern adjusts the steering oar again. A faint breeze slides across the deck, carrying the smell of salt and tar through the cold air. Most of the crew remains asleep. Yet even in sleep, small signs of belief linger around them. Amulets tied to belts, weapons resting beside hands. Quiet gestures performed without drawing attention. These habits travel with sailors just as surely as their cloaks and tools. The Longship glides forward through the silent fjord. The stars move slowly overhead, and scattered across the narrow deck, the small traditions and superstitions of Viking sailors drift quietly through the frozen night, offering comfort in a world where the sea never promises certainty. The small rituals fade back into the quiet rhythm of the ship, and the Longship continues sliding across the frozen fjord beneath the wide northern sky. The crew rests in their narrow places along the benches wrapped in wool and fur. The watchman remains steady at the bow, and the helmsman guides the vessel patiently through the dark water. For a while nothing changes, the night simply continues, and in that long stretch of stillness your thoughts begin to wander. There is something about the quiet of open water that encourages reflection. With little movement and almost no conversation, the mind drifts easily from one memory to another. You notice it happening to some of the sailors as well. One man stirs, slightly opens his eyes and gazes out across the fjord for several moments before settling again. His expression looks distant, as if he's seeing something far beyond the dark water around the ship. Perhaps he is thinking about home. Evidence from Norse settlements and historical texts suggests that many Viking voyages lasted weeks or even months, depending on the distance travelled. Crews might leave their homes in Sabbath and spring and not return until late summer or autumn. During those long journeys, memories of family and familiar landscapes likely followed sailors wherever they travelled. You imagine what those memories might feel like on a night like this. The warmth of a longhouse fire, the sound of wind moving through pine forests instead of across open water, the smell of cooking bread or roasted meat drifting through the air. Small details that seem ordinary on land might become powerful thoughts when surrounded by nothing but sea and sky. A faint movement catches your eye. One sailor lifts a hand from beneath his cloak and rubs his face slowly before letting his arm rest again along the bench. His eyes remain open, staring quietly toward the stars. He does not appear troubled, just thoughtful. A small but intriguing clue from archaeological discoveries hints that some sailors carried personal tokens from home during voyages. Items such as carved pendants, beads, or small pieces of jewellery found in burial sites may have served as reminders of family connections or personal identity. Holding such objects during quiet moments might have helped travellers feel closer to the places they left behind. You wonder if any of the sailors here carry something like that tonight. The watchman near the bow shifts his stance and glances briefly toward the sleeping crew. His gaze pauses on the captain for a moment before returning to the horizon. Responsibility keeps him focused on the present. Still, even watchmen have long hours to think. The sky above continues turning slowly. Stars drift westward, while new ones rise from the east, marking the steady passage of time across the night. You lean your head back slightly and follow those patterns with your eyes. It's easy to imagine sailors studying the same sky thousands of years ago while thinking about distant shores. The fjord remains quiet except for the soft whisper of water along the hull. A thin fragment of ice brushes the ship before slipping away into the darkness behind it. The helmsman at the stern shifts his grip on the steering oar, adjusting the vessel's direction slightly. Everything continues moving forward. There remains some uncertainty among historians about how sailors coped emotionally with long separations from home during extended voyages. Written sources rarely describe personal feelings in detail, leaving modern scholars to interpret clues from artifacts, stories, and cultural traditions. Yet human nature rarely changes across centuries. Standing here tonight, surrounded by quiet water and distant stars, it feels natural to imagine the crew thinking about the lives waiting for them beyond the horizon. Families, villages, familiar coastlines. The sailor who had been staring at the sky slowly closes his eyes again and pulls his cloak higher around his shoulders. Sleep returns. The longship creaks softly as another gentle wave passes beneath it. The watchmen continue their silent watch, and somewhere in the quiet minds of the crew, thoughts of home drift across the frozen night like distant shores waiting beyond the sea. The quiet reflections drifting through the minds of the crew slowly fade as the longship continues its calm journey across the frozen fjord. The sailors rest in their narrow places along the benches, their cloaks pulled high against the cold air. Frost glimmers faintly on ropes and rails, and the sky above remains filled with stars that seem almost close enough to touch. Somewhere near the bow, the watchman lifts his head slightly, not because of danger, but because of movement in the sky. A dark shape passes briefly across the stars before disappearing into the night. Then another follows. Birds. You lean forward slightly, watching as two more shapes glide silently above the ship. Their wings beat slowly as they travel across the fjord before fading into the distance. Even at night, the sea and sky remain full of life. Evidence from Norse settlements and coastal sight shows that Viking sailors paid close attention to the behavior of birds during voyages. Certain species could signal the presence of land nearby, especially when ships travelled far from familiar coastlines. Seeing birds often meant something important. Land might not be far away. You notice the watchman tracking the birds carefully until they vanish beyond the horizon. His eyes follow their path for several seconds before returning to the dark water ahead. Perhaps he recognizes the species. Perhaps he is simply noting the direction that he travelled. Another faint flutter passes overhead. This time only one bird crosses the sky. It glides low above the water before rising again and disappearing toward the distant shoreline. In many Norse traditions, birds carried symbolic meaning as well. Ravens in particular held strong associations with the god Odin, who was often described as being accompanied by two ravens that travelled across the world gathering knowledge. Because of that connection, ravens sometimes appeared as symbols of guidance or watchfulness in Viking culture. The bird you saw might not be a raven at all, but in the quiet darkness of the fjord, it is easy to imagine why sailors might think about such stories when wings pass across the night sky. A curious historical footnote comes from descriptions of Viking voyages that mention sailors occasionally releasing birds to help locate land during long journeys. If the bird returned to the ship, land might still be far away. If it flew confidently in one direction and did not return, sailors could follow its path. Such techniques appear in a few medieval accounts describing early seafaring traditions. Tonight, no one releases a bird intentionally, yet the natural movements of wildlife still offer small clues about the world beyond the darkness. The watchman at the bow adjusts his stance again and scans the horizon. The helmsman at the stern continues guiding the vessel with steady patience. Along the benches, the rest of the crew remains mostly asleep, unaware that birds have briefly passed above them. Another sailor stirs quietly and lifts his head. Perhaps the faint sound of wings reached his ears. He glances toward the sky for a moment before settling back beneath his cloak. The cold air carries even the smaller sounds clearly across the deck. Far above, one final shape crosses the stars before vanishing into the night. The fjord returns to silence. Researchers studying Viking navigation have often pointed out how closely sailors observed the natural world around them. The movement of birds, the colour of water, the direction of waves and the pattern of clouds all offered information that could help guide a voyage. Modern navigators rely on instruments. Ancient sailors relied on attention. Every small detail mattered. You glance once more toward the empty sky where the birds disappeared. Perhaps they are heading toward cliffs along the coastline. Perhaps they are searching for fish in darker waters beyond the fjord. Either way, their brief presence has reminded the watchman that even during the quietest hours of night, the world around the longship remains alive. The ship creaks softly as another ripple passes beneath the hull. Frost continues gathering along the ropes. Stars drift slowly westward. And somewhere beyond the darkness, unseen, birds travel across the northern sky while the longship carries its resting crew steadily onward through the frozen Viking night. The last shadow of the wings fades from the sky, and the fjord settles once more into quiet stillness. The longship moves forward through the dark water with a patient rhythm that never fully stops. Along the benches, the sailors remain wrapped in their cloaks, their breathing slow and steady, while frost continues gathering along ropes and rails. The night has grown deep now, cold enough that every breath leaves a pale cloud in the air, cold enough that even small mistakes could become dangerous. You notice this when one of the sailors shifts his position near the rail. His boot slides slightly across the frost-covered deck before catching against the wood of the bench leg. The movement is minor, but it reminds you how close the sea always is. Just beyond the rail, the black water stretches silently beneath the ship. Surviving Viking vessels reveal how low longships sat in the water. Their shallow hulls allowed them to travel along rivers and coastal shallows, but the design also meant the decks only a short distance above the sea itself. In calm conditions, this made rowing easier. In rough weather or icy conditions, it could become far more dangerous. A single careless step might send someone over the side. You glance towards the dark water again. The surface looks calm, yet the temperature alone would make falling a terrifying experience. Cold water drains heat from the body far faster than cold air. Even a strong swimmer could lose strength quickly in such conditions. Sailors throughout history have understood this risk. One intriguing detail uncovered in some Viking-era texts suggests that experienced crews often stayed aware of their footing during cold voyages, especially when frost or ice formed across the deck. The narrow space left little room for mistakes. The sailor who slipped earlier adjusts his position carefully, now planting his boots more firmly against the wood, before settling back against the rib of the ship. He glances briefly toward the rail, as if confirming the distance between himself and the sea. Then he pulls his cloak tighter and closes his eyes again. The watchman at the bow notices the movement, but does not react strongly. A brief glance across the deck seems enough to confirm that everything remains under control. He returns his attention to the horizon. The helmsman at the stern maintains his steady stance beside the steering oar. The longship continues gliding forward through the fjord. A faint scraping sound returns as another thin fragment of ice brushes along the hull before drifting away behind the ship. The deck grows slightly more slippery as frost spreads across the planks. You shift your own feet carefully, testing the grip of your boots against the wood. It becomes clear how important balance must have been for sailors travelling on vessels like this. Every step requires attention. Every movement must consider the narrow space and the restless water surrounding the ship. There remains some debate among historians about how frequently accidents occurred during Viking voyages. Written records from the period rarely describe ordinary mishaps in detail, leaving modern researchers to infer risks from the design of ships and the conditions sailors likely faced. Yet standing here tonight, the potential danger feels obvious. The sea waits only a few steps away, and the night air offers little mercy to anyone who might fall into the freezing water. Still, the crew appears remarkably comfortable with the situation. Experience has taught them how to move safely across the deck. Hands touch rails when necessary. Boots step carefully around ropes and gear. And when sailors rise or sit, they do so with quiet awareness of the ship's motion. The man who slipped earlier shifts again, but this time his movement is slow and controlled. His boots remain firmly planted against the wood. Satisfied, he settles deeper into his cloak. The fjord remains calm. The stars above continue their slow drift across the sky. The watchmen scan the horizon. The helmsman guides the ship, and just beyond the rail, the dark water flows silently beside the longship, reminding everyone aboard how thin the line can be between safety and the freezing sea below. The quiet reminder of the cold sea fades as the longship continues drifting through the fjord. The crew remains mostly still along the benches, wrapped tightly in their cloaks, while the night stretches onward. Frost has spread farther across the deck now, turning the wooden planks pale and faintly sparkling beneath the moonlight. You notice the change when the helmsman shifts his weight at the stern. His boot presses against the deck and produces a faint scraping sound as the thin layer of frost cracks beneath the sole. He pauses for a moment, studying the surface near his feet, then adjusts his stance carefully. The deck has grown more treacherous. Moisture from sea spray and breath has slowly frozen across the wood, forming a thin sheet that glistens in the cold air. It is not thick enough to look like solid ice, yet it is enough to make the planks slippery. You run your hand lightly along the bench beside you. The wood feels stiff with cold and a faint dusting of frost coats its edges. Archaeological reconstructions of Viking ships have shown that open decks expose sailors constantly to weather conditions. Unlike later vessels with enclosed spaces below deck longships, left most of the crew sitting directly beneath the sky, which meant frost, rain and snow often became part of everyday life on board. Tonight the cold has claimed the deck. One of the sailors along the benches wakes slowly and lifts his head. His eyes focus on the frost covering the planks before he carefully swings his feet down from the bench. He tests the surface with a cautious step. The frost crunches softly beneath his boot. Satisfied, he stands and stretches his legs for a moment before moving a few careful steps along the narrow space between benches. His balance remains steady. Every step appears deliberate. A small but intriguing clue from ship excavations reveals that Viking footwear often used thick leather, soles reinforced with stitching or additional layers of hide. Such boots would have offered better grip on wet or icy surfaces compared with smooth sandals or thin shoes. Looking at the sailor walking carefully across the deck, that design suddenly makes perfect sense. He pauses beside the mast and knocks his boot lightly against the wooden base, shaking away a small crust of frost before returning to his bench. The watchman at the bow shifts his stance as well, stamping one foot gently to keep circulation flowing through his leg. Frost cracks beneath the movement, producing a series of quiet snapping sounds. The helmsman remains steady at the stern, though you notice him adjusting his footing slightly as he guides the steering oar. The longship creaks softly while a ripple passes beneath the hull. The frost on the deck catches the moonlight and reflects it in faint shimmering patterns. From a distance, the planks might almost look dusted with silver, yet the beauty hides the risk. The narrow deck offers little room to recover if someone loses balance. A misplaced step could send a sailor sliding towards the rail. There remains discussion among historians about how frequently Viking crews travelled during freezing conditions like these. Many voyages likely took place during warmer seasons, but trade exploration or necessity may have pushed some ships into colder waters, where frost and ice became unavoidable challenges. Tonight appears to be one of those colder journeys. The fjord itself shows signs of winter. Thin sheets of ice drift across the surface, brushing quietly against the hull before breaking apart behind the ship. The sky remains clear, allowing the temperature to fall steadily as the night continues. You notice another sailor stirring along the benches. He lifts his head, studies the frost-covered deck, then pulls his cloak tighter and chooses to remain seated rather than risk standing. Perhaps warmth feels more important than stretching his legs. The longship glides forward through the still water. The watchmen maintain their quiet vigil at the bow. The helmsman continues guiding the vessel with calm precision. And across the deck, the thin, frozen layer beneath your boots reminds everyone aboard that winter has fully claimed the night. Even the smallest movement must respect the cold, because on a narrow Viking longship drifting through icy water, the deck itself can become one more challenge waiting quietly beneath your feet. The frozen deck beneath your boots glimmers faintly as the longship continues gliding across the dark fjord. Frost coats the rails and ropes and the air feels colder than it did earlier in the night. The sailors along the benches remain wrapped in their cloaks, breathing slowly while the ship moves forward through the quiet water. Yet something subtle begins to change. At first you do not notice it. The night still looks deep and black across the horizon. The stars remain bright above the mast. The watchman stands steady at the bow while the helmsman guides the ship from the stern. But slowly, almost invisibly, the darkness begins to soften. You see it first along the eastern edge of the sky. A faint grey band appears just above the distant hills bordering the fjord. It is so slight that it almost blends with the night itself, yet once your eyes catch it, the change becomes impossible to ignore. Morning is beginning its slow approach. The watchman at the bow notices it too. He lifts his chin and studies the horizon carefully before shifting his stance. His breath drifts upward in pale clouds while he watches the sky brighten by the smallest degree. Night has not ended yet, but its grip is loosening. The stars still shine above the ship, though a few near the horizon have begun fading into the growing light. Their reflections ripple across the water whenever the hull moves through a gentle wave. You lean back slightly and follow the sky with your eyes. The longship creaks softly as another current passes beneath it. Across the benches, one sailor stirs. He opens his eyes slowly and glances toward the east, where the grey glow spreads gradually across the sky. For a moment he simply watches it before pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. Sleep will not last much longer. The approaching dawn carries a quiet promise of activity. Surviving Viking ships discovered in burial mounds reveal that longships were designed for early movement during daylight hours. Rowing sail adjustments, navigation and coastal observation all required good visibility. Crews likely organised their routines around the rhythm of natural light, which means sunrise often marked the beginning of another demanding day. A thin fragment of ice drifts beside the hull before breaking apart against the planks. The sound travels clearly through the cold air. Another sailor shifts along the bench and lifts his head slightly. He follows the direction of the watchman's gaze toward the horizon. The grey light grows a little stronger, still faint, still quiet, but unmistakable now. A curious historical note appears in several Norse sagas, describing how travellers often measured time at sea by watching the slow return of daylight. Without clocks or mechanical instruments, the changing sky itself became the most reliable marker of passing hours. Standing here now, you understand how easily sailors might learn to read those changes. The darkness above slowly thins. The stars nearest the horizon fade one by one. The sky shifts from black to deep blue. The watchman near the bow stretches his shoulders before continuing his silent observation of the fjord. His posture remains calm, though there is a hint of readiness in the way he moves now. Morning means work. The helmsman at the stern glances toward the east as well, before returning his attention to the steering oar. The longship continues gliding forward through calm water. A faint breeze passes across the deck, stirring the bundled sail above the mast. Frost along the ropes glitters softly in the growing light. Another sailor wakes and rubs his face slowly before sitting upright. He notices the horizon immediately. A quiet breath escapes his mouth as he studies the sky. There remains some discussion among historians about how early Viking crews typically began their daily activities during voyages. While exact schedules are rarely recorded, practical needs suggest that sailors would have used the earliest usable light to begin preparing for rowing sail adjustments or navigation tasks. Watching the sky brighten now, it becomes easy to imagine that routine. Soon the crew will stretch stiff muscles. Hands will reach for oars. The sail will loosen from its bundled rest above the mast. But for now, the ship remains in the quiet moment between night and day. The fjord glows faintly under the growing light. The frozen deck still crunches softly beneath shifting boots. And along the eastern horizon, the slow return of morning spreads gently across the sky, promising that the long Viking night is finally beginning to end. The grey band of morning light continues widening across the eastern horizon. It spreads slowly at first, almost cautiously, turning the black sky to a deep blue that grows brighter with every passing minute. The stars fade one by one, slipping quietly from view as the longship glides through the cold water of the fjord. You feel the change in the air as much as you see it. The darkness that wrapped the ship through the night begins loosening its hold. Along the benches, the sailors start to stir. One man stretches his arms carefully above his head, his joints stiff from hours of sitting against the narrow wooden plank. Another rubs his hands together, breathing warm air into his palms before pulling his cloak back around his shoulders. Sleep fades gradually across the deck. The watchman at the bow finally lowers his chin from the horizon and turns slightly toward the crew behind him. He does not shout or call out loudly. Instead, he simply moves along the narrow space between benches, touching a shoulder here, nudging a boot there. The message spreads quietly. Morning is coming. The captain lifts his head first among the resting men near the centre of the ship. His eyes move across the deck in a slow survey before settling briefly on the brightening sky. He sits upright, adjusting his cloak as the faint light begins reaching across the water. The crew takes its cue from that movement. More sailors rise from their resting position. Boots touch the frost-covered planks carefully. Cloaks are tightened, arms stretched to loosen stiff muscles after the long cold night. You notice several men rolling their shoulders or flexing their fingers as they wake fully. Rowing demands strength, and strength requires preparation. The benches that serve as beds through the night begin returning to their daytime purpose. Hands reach beneath them to retrieve small bundles of gear. A sailor lifts a coil of rope and checks its knots while another retrieves a leather pouch tucked beside the rib of the ship. A few men glance upward toward the bundled sail above the mast. Soon that sail will need to be released. Surviving longship remains discovered in Scandinavia show how carefully every part of these vessels was arranged for efficiency. Rowing benches, rigging lines, cargo spaces and steering equipment all occupied precise positions so the crew could move quickly when needed. Morning routines aboard the ship likely followed similar patterns. Every sailor knew where to sit. Every sailor knew what task belonged to him. The helmsman at the stern finally rolls his shoulders and shifts his grip on the steering oar. His arms must feel heavy after guiding the vessel through most of the night. Yet he keeps his posture steady as the sky continues brightening. A faint pink tint appears along the eastern clouds now. The fjord begins revealing more of its shape. Dark outlines of distant hills rise from the horizon where only shadow existed before. Thin sheets of drifting ice catch the new light, reflecting it in pale silver across the water. One sailor near the mast bends down and brushes frost from the deck with the side of his boot. The movement clears a small patch of wood where he will soon stand. Another sailor stretches his legs carefully before settling onto his rowing bench again. A quiet murmur of voices begins spreading across the ship as men greet the morning. Nothing loud, just the low sounds of waking conversation. A curious note preserved in Norse writings hints that crews often relied on simple routines to organize life aboard their ship. Without written schedules or formal signals, daily activities followed patterns shaped by experience and necessity. Morning light meant work, night meant rest whenever possible. Watching the crew awaken now, those rhythms feel very natural. The captain stands slowly, his cloak falling around his shoulders as he surveys the fjord ahead. The watchmen step aside slightly, allowing him a clear view of the water and distant shoreline. He studies the horizon for a long moment, then he nods once. The ship continues moving smoothly through calm water. The sky grows brighter with each passing breath. More sailors settle onto the benches beside their oars. Others check ropes or glance toward the sail lines hanging from the mast. The frozen quiet of night has almost completely disappeared now. Morning has taken its place, and aboard the longship the crew prepares to leave behind the stillness of frozen darkness and return to the demanding rhythm of another day at sea. The pale light of morning spreads steadily across the fjord, and the longship emerges from the darkness of night as if rising slowly from the sea itself. The cold air remains sharp, but the faint warmth of dawn begins touching the surface of the water. Frost still glitters along the rails and ropes, though the growing light softens the harsh edge of the frozen deck. Around you the crew is fully awakened. Sailors sit along the benches where they slept through the night, now stretching stiff arms and rolling their shoulders as they prepare for the work ahead. Cloaks shift as men rise and adjust their clothing. A few stamp their boots lightly against the planks to restore feeling in their feet. The quiet murmur of morning voices spreads across the narrow deck. The watchmen who guarded the bow during the night finally step aside, rubbing warmth into their hands after hours of standing still in the cold. One of them glances toward the east, where the sky now glows with soft shades of pink and gold. Sunrise approaches. The captain stands near the center of the ship, studying the water ahead. In the growing light, the fjord reveals more of its shape. Dark ridges of shoreline rise from the horizon, and scattered ice drifts slowly along the current beside the hull. He seems satisfied with what he sees. With a small gesture of his hand, the quiet morning preparation shifts into motion. Several sailors stand and reach upward toward the ropes securing the bundled sail. Their fingers work quickly through knots stiffened by frost. The thick wool cloth loosens gradually as the lines release their hold. The sail begins to unfold. It moves slowly at first, heavy with cold moisture gathered during the night. Then the fabric spreads wider as the sailors guide it downward along the mast. Reconstructed Viking ships and preserved sail fragments reveal how impressive these wool sails must have been when fully opened. Large woven panels created a powerful surface capable of catching even moderate winds, allowing longships to travel swiftly across open water without constant rowing. Watching it unfurl, now you see how the crew handles the task with practiced coordination. Each man knows his position. Each rope finds its place. The sail expands until its full shape catches the faint morning breeze moving across the fjord. The cloth trembles slightly, then fills. The longship responds immediately. The hull shifts as the wind presses into the sail, nudging the vessel forward with renewed strength. The helmsman adjusts the steering oar to balance the motion while the sailors along the benches settle into position beside their oars. Rowing may still be needed, but for now the wind carries much of the work. A curious detail uncovered during experiments with reconstructed Viking ships showed that crews often combined sail power with rowing depending on wind strength and water conditions. This flexible approach allowed longships to maintain speed even when the weather changed unexpectedly. Out here on the fjords, such adaptability would have been essential. The sun finally appears above the distant hills. A narrow arc of golden light breaks across the horizon, casting long reflections across the water. The frost along the ship's rails sparkles brilliantly for a moment before slowly beginning to melt. Warmth has not yet arrived, but the promise of it travels with the rising sun. The crew moves with new energy now. Hands tighten ropes. Boots shift along the deck. Voices grow a little stronger as the men prepare for the day's journey. Yet despite the growing activity, the memory of the night still lingers quietly around you. The cold air, the creaking wood, the distant splashes in the dark water, the faint song drifting across the deck, the frozen stars above the mast. Those long hours carried their own rhythm, one that only sailors truly understand. Life aboard a Viking longship did not stop when darkness fell. It simply changed pace. Night demanded impatience. Morning demanded strength, and the sea accepted both without complaint. The captain looks once more across the fjord before giving a final nod. The sail fills more firmly with wind. The ship glides forward beneath the brightening sky. Another day at sea has begun. But before the crew fully commits the work ahead, the long quiet hours of the night seem to settle gently behind you like a fading dream. The cold benches, the whispered stories, the drifting frost, all of it slowly dissolves in the growing light of morning. Now the fjord shines beneath the rising sun. The longship moves steadily forward, and somewhere within the calm rhythm of water and wind, the memory of the frozen Viking night fades into the peaceful warmth of dawn. Word count 1114. Now the day has begun, but your journey through the long Viking night is ending as well. The quiet hours aboard the longship drift gently away, just like the last stars fading from the sky. If you imagine the scene one last time, the ship continues gliding across the calm fjord, its sail full, and its crew ready for the work ahead. The frost slowly melts from the rails. The morning sun warms the cold wood beneath the sailors' boots. Voices rise softly as the crew prepares for another day at sea. But for you, the moment grows quieter. The water whispers gently along the hull, the sky brightens above the mast. The longship becomes smaller in your mind as it sails farther into the calm morning light. You can let the sounds of the fjord fade now. The creaking wood, the distant splash of water, the slow breathing of the crew resting through the night. All of it drifts away like a soft tide pulling back from the shore. Your thoughts grow calm, your breathing slow. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the longship carries its sailors safely into the new day, while you remain wrapped in the quiet peace of the night that came before. So let the frozen sea grow still, let the stars disappear into the sky, and let your mind rest gently in the calm silence that follows a long journey through history. Sweet dreams.